Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The water meter clicked like a nervous heartbeat in the basement, counting dollars I couldn't afford to lose. I'd bought the Craftsman bungalow on Woodburn Avenue with every cent of my savings, a 1920s beauty with good bones and terrible plumbing that the previous owner had practically given away. The plan was simple: 6 months of renovation, flip it for profit, move on to the next project. What I hadn't planned on was sleeping here to save on rent, surrounded by half-torn walls and the peculiar habits of an old house. The first time the upstairs bathroom faucet started running by itself, I blamed the ancient pipes. I'd shut off the main water supply before heading down to work on the kitchen cabinets, standard procedure to avoid flooding while wrestling with corroded connections. But 20 minutes into my work, I heard it. A steady stream hitting porcelain above my head, thin and persistent like a whispered accusation. I climbed the narrow stairs, each step creaking a different note in the house's wooden symphony. The faucet handle sat in the off position, cold and still under my palm. Yet water continued its methodical descent into the basin. I twisted it left, then right. The flow stopped with a mechanical shudder that traveled through the walls like a sigh. Standing there in the bathroom's yellow light, surrounded by peeling wallpaper that looked like diseased skin, I felt the weight of the house settling around me. Old houses had personalities, I told myself. Quirks developed over decades of expansion and contraction, settling and resettling. This was just another one of those quirks. But when I returned downstairs and the sound began again 15 minutes later, quirk felt like an inadequate explanation. The pattern established itself over the following weeks. Every time I shut off the main water and descended to the ground floor, the bathroom faucet would begin its phantom flow. Only when I climbed back up would it cease, as if my presence alone could command the rebellion of copper pipes and rubber gaskets. I mentioned it to Rodriguez, the electrician I'd hired to update the house's ancient wiring. He listened with the patient expression of a man who'd heard every possible complaint about old houses, nodding as he tested outlets with his voltage pen. Could be a pressure issue, he said, not looking up from his work. These old systems, they get air pockets, temperature changes, foundation settling, makes them do weird things. His explanation felt reasonable in daylight, surrounded by the normal sounds of renovation, sawing, drilling, the radio playing classic rock from the kitchen. But late at night, when I lay on my air mattress in what would eventually be the living room, listening to the house breathe around me, reason felt like a thin blanket against the dark. The chain started its dance on a Thursday evening in October. I'd been working on stripping wallpaper from the stairwell, methodical work that left my mind free to wander. The light fixture at the top of the stairs was original to the house, a simple glass shade suspended from a brass chain that had turned green with age. I'd noticed it swaying slightly before, probably from drafts or my footsteps on the stairs below. But this movement was different, deliberate. The chain traced slow circles in the air, clockwise, then counterclockwise, generating a low metallic hum that seemed to seep into the walls themselves. I stood halfway up the stairs, wallpaper scraper in hand, watching the hypnotic motion. Outside, the October wind pushed through the bare branches of the oak tree in the front yard, rattling windows and whistling through the gaps around the front door. But the chain moved against the wind direction, tracing its circles with mechanical precision that defied the random gusts. I climbed the remaining steps and reached for the chain, expecting it to still under my touch. Instead, it continued its rotation, the metal links sliding through my fingers like a snake made of brass. The humming grew louder, resonating through the floorboards, down through the walls, until it felt like the entire house was singing a single low note. When I finally grasped the chain firmly and held it motionless, the silence that followed felt heavier than the sound had been. That night, I lay awake listening to the house's nocturnal conversations, settling wood, expanding metal, the distant rumble of late traffic on Reading Road. But underneath it all, I swore I could still hear that humming, so faint it might have been tinnitus or imagination. The water bills arrived in a manila envelope that had been forwarding through 3 different addresses before reaching me. Property records from the previous owner, the realtor had explained, sometimes took months to fully transfer. I'd expected utility bills, but what I found among the mundane statements and notices was more interesting. Water usage records dating back 2 years before the sale. The numbers made no sense. During months when the house had been empty, officially vacant and listed for sale, the water meter had recorded usage patterns that suggested full occupancy. Not just occasional use that might indicate maintenance or showing the property, but regular, consistent consumption. Late-night spikes that suggested someone had been running water between midnight and 4 in the morning, every night, for weeks at a time. I spread the bills across the kitchen counter I'd been refinishing, trying to make sense of the data. The previous owner, according to the realtor, had been an elderly man who'd moved to assisted living. The house had been empty for 8 months before I bought it, yet the water records told a different story, a story of phantom occupancy and impossible consumption. The discovery of the note came by accident during my renovation of the upstairs bathroom. I'd been removing the medicine cabinet, a mirror-fronted metal box that had probably been installed sometime in the 50s. As I worked it loose from its mounting, the mirror separated from its frame with a sound like breaking bones. Folded behind the silvered glass, yellow with age and brittle at the edges, was a piece of paper covered in handwriting that looked like it had been done in haste. The ink had faded to brown, but the words were still legible. "If you hear the chain, don't call his name. He's been waiting too long already. The water knows when you're alone." Below that, in different handwriting, newer but still old enough to have yellowed, "Found this when we moved in, 1987. Leaving it for the next ones. The Hendersons," and below that, in pencil so light I almost missed it. "Still here, still waiting. 2019. I sat on the bathroom floor, holding the note with hands that had developed a fine tremor. 3 different messages, 3 different periods of occupancy, all acknowledging something that waited in this house. Something connected to the chain, to the water, to the late-night hours when normal people slept. The rational part of my mind suggested explanations. Previous owners with mental health issues, pranks, coincidence. But rationality felt increasingly fragile as I sat there, surrounded by the exposed bones of the house, holding evidence that I wasn't the first to notice what lived here alongside the copper pipes and oak beams. That night, the chain began its rotation at exactly 12:17 a.m. I knew the time because I'd been lying awake, staring at my phone, wondering if I should research the house's history or try to forget what I'd found behind the mirror. The humming started soft, almost musical, then grew until it seemed to emanate from every surface in the house. I forced myself to lie still, to not go upstairs and grab the chain, to not feed whatever pattern I'd been unconsciously establishing. But the sound pulled at something deep in my chest, a resonance that made my ribs ache and my teeth clench. After 20 minutes, it stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The silence that followed felt expectant. I began researching the house's history with the dedicated obsession of a man who needed answers more than sleep. The Cincinnati Historical Society had records going back to the house's construction in 1923, built for a family named Whitman, who'd lived there until 1956. After that, ownership had changed hands regularly, never more than 5 years with any single family. The pattern was consistent. Families would buy the house with enthusiasm, begin renovations or improvements, then sell abruptly. The real estate records were littered with motivated seller and price-to-move notations. No explanations, just a long succession of people who decided they needed to be somewhere else. I found one newspaper article from 1987, a small piece in the community section about a family that had won a civic award for home restoration. The Hendersons, the name from the note, had been recognized for their work on a challenging property on Woodburn Avenue. But the article mentioned that they'd moved before the award ceremony, donating their prize money to a local charity. The most disturbing discovery came from city records I accessed through a friend who worked in municipal planning. Water usage data going back decades showed the same impossible pattern I'd seen in the recent bills. Every owner, in every decade, had recorded water consumption during periods when the house was supposedly empty, as if something in the house continued to need water regardless of human occupancy. The chain's rotations became more frequent, no longer confined to late-night hours. I'd be working on kitchen cabinets and hear it start up above my head, that low humming that seemed to call for attention. Sometimes it would last minutes, sometimes hours. I stopped trying to make it stop, partly because my interruptions seemed to make it worse, and partly because I was beginning to understand that the chain wasn't malfunctioning. It was communicating. The water began running more aggressively. Not just the bathroom faucet, but any tap in the house would begin flowing the moment I shut off the main supply and moved to the lower floor. Kitchen sink, utility room, even the basement spigot I'd forgotten existed. As if whatever lived in the pipes had grown stronger, more confident in its ability to defy physics and plumbing logic. I started talking to it, not consciously at first, just muttering while I worked, the way anyone might mutter to themselves during repetitive tasks. But gradually, I realized I was directing my words upward, toward the ceiling, toward whatever presence made the chain dance and the water flow. "You're making this difficult," I'd say while trying to work on plumbing with phantom faucets running above my head. "I'm trying to fix this place up, make it nice again." The response was always the same. The humming would grow slightly louder, or the water would increase its flow, as if acknowledging my words, but disagreeing with my intentions. It took me 3 months to understand what it was trying to tell me. I was working late on a December evening, installing new cabinet hardware in the kitchen, when I realized the house was quieter than it had been in weeks. No humming from upstairs, no phantom water running, just the normal sounds of an old house in winter, expanding heating ducts, settling wood, the occasional crack of cooling metal. For the first time since I'd moved in, the house felt genuinely empty, and I missed it. The thought crept in like cold air through poorly sealed windows, insidious and uncomfortable. I'd grown accustomed to the presence, whatever it was. The sounds it made had become a backdrop to my work, as familiar as my own breathing. Without them, the house felt abandoned in a way that had nothing to do with furnishing or decoration. I found myself listening for the chain, hoping for the sound of running water from upstairs. When neither came, I felt genuinely lonely, in a way I hadn't experienced since childhood. That's when I understood what the note had been trying to warn me about. Not about calling its name, I still didn't know what to call it, but about the seductive nature of its presence. The way isolation and routine could make even impossible things feel normal, even comforting. The way you could start to need something that shouldn't exist. I packed my tools that night with hands that shook from more than the December cold. I'd lived in the house for 4 months, and in that time, something fundamental had shifted in my understanding of solitude, of what it meant to share space with the unknown. The renovation was nowhere near complete, but I couldn't stay any longer without risking something I wasn't prepared to lose. As I loaded my truck under the yellow glow of the streetlight, I heard it one last time, the chain beginning its slow rotation, the humming that seemed to emanate from the house's very bones. But this time, the sound felt different, not demanding or attention-seeking, but almost mournful. The sound of something that had grown accustomed to company and didn't want to be alone again. I drove to a motel on the other side of the city and spent 3 days convincing myself I'd made the right decision. On the 4th day, I put the house back on the market, priced to move quickly, with full disclosure of all the plumbing issues I'd discovered during renovation. The realtor asked why I wasn't finishing the work first, maximizing profit the way house flippers usually did. I told her I'd found another opportunity, but the truth was simpler and more disturbing. I was afraid that if I went back, I wouldn't want to leave again. The house sold within 2 weeks to a young couple who were excited about the potential they saw in the craftsman details and original hardwood floors. I watched from my car as they did their final walkthrough, noting how they lingered in the bathroom, probably discussing tile choices and fixture placement. I wondered how long it would take them to notice the faucet, to hear the chain song, to find whatever new note would be waiting behind the mirror, whether they would run as I had, or whether they would be the ones to finally understand what it was that had been waiting in that house for so long, content to make itself known through brass and copper, through the simple elements that connected every human dwelling to the basic necessities of life. As I drove away, I found myself hoping they would be stronger than I had been, or perhaps weaker. Either way, they wouldn't be alone. Story 2. The neon sign outside the Desert Rose Motel flickered between pink and dead black, casting intermittent shadows across the cracked asphalt parking lot. I'd been driving for 14 hours straight, my eyes burning from the endless ribbon of Interstate 40. When Flagstaff finally appeared like a mirage in my headlights, the place looked forgotten, a relic from the days when this stretch of road actually mattered, before the new highway bypass turned it into a ghost corridor for truckers and drifters. Room 127 smelled of industrial disinfectant and something else underneath, something organic and stale that the chemicals couldn't quite mask. The carpet bore the evidence of 1,000 transient lives, coffee stains shaped like continents, burn marks from cigarettes, dark patches where liquids had soaked deep into the fibers and never quite dried. The air conditioning unit rattled against the window frame with mechanical persistence, a white noise that should have been comforting, but somehow made the silence between its cycles feel more pronounced. I dropped my duffel bag beside the dresser and surveyed my temporary kingdom. The bed dominated the small space, its brown polyester comforter pulled tight across military corners. 2 pillows sat propped against the headboard like sentries, and beside the bed, a lamp with a faded shade cast amber light across everything, making the room feel submerged in honey. The bathroom mirror reflected a man I barely recognized. 3 days of stubble, eyes rimmed red from too much caffeine and too little sleep. The conference in Phoenix had been a disaster, my presentation falling flat before investors who'd made their decision before I'd even opened my laptop. Now I was driving back to a life that felt as temporary as this motel room, with nothing to show for the trip but the bitter taste of failure and the weight of what I'd left behind. I stripped down to my boxers and t-shirt, brushing my teeth at the cracked porcelain sink, while the faucet dripped a steady rhythm against the stained basin. Through the thin walls came the muffled sounds of the highway, the distant rumble of 18-wheelers carrying their cargo through the darkness, the occasional whine of a motorcycle pushing through the night air. The bed accepted my weight with a soft compression, the mattress sagging just enough to remind me of how many bodies had laid here before mine. I reached for the lamp switch, pausing as my fingers found the warm metal base. For a moment, I had the distinct feeling of being watched, that peculiar sensation of eyes on skin that makes every nerve ending suddenly alert. I turned toward the window, but the heavy curtains were drawn tight, blocking any view of the parking lot beyond. The room plunged into darkness when I clicked off the lamp, leaving only the thin line of light bleeding under the bathroom door, where I'd left the overhead burning. I closed my eyes and tried to let the day drain away, tried to forget the presentation slides that had crashed, the uncomfortable silence from the investors, the long drive ahead tomorrow. That's when I felt it. The mattress gave way near my feet, a deliberate depression that spoke of weight applied with careful precision. Not the random settling of old springs, but the unmistakable pressure of something large and purposeful testing the surface. I held perfectly still, my breath caught somewhere between my lungs and throat, and counted the impressions as they formed. One larger indentation slightly separated from 4 smaller ones, the unmistakable pattern of fingers exploring the firmness of foam and fabric. The amber light from the table lamp flickered, once, twice, then steady again, as if whatever was there had brushed against the cord or shifted the table. The pressure retreated gradually, the way a hand might lift from a surface with reluctant care. But when I dared to look down toward my feet, I could see the depression remained. Even in the dim light filtering from the bathroom, the mattress held the shape of fingers, a perfect arc pressed into the surface where no hand should be. My heart hammered against my ribs as I shifted position, pulling my legs up toward my chest. The movement caused the bottom sheet to pull taut, and that's when I noticed it. A crease that hadn't been there before, running along the edge of the bed at the head, exactly where someone might sit to watch another person sleep. I lay motionless for what felt like hours, every small sound amplified in the darkness. The air conditioning cycled on and off with mechanical regularity. A door slammed somewhere along the motel corridor. A truck downshifted on the highway. its engine brake echoing across the desert landscape. But underneath these familiar noises, I began to detect something else, the almost imperceptible sound of controlled breathing that wasn't quite in rhythm with my own. When I finally worked up the courage to reach for the lamp, my fingers trembled against the switch. Light flooded the room again, revealing nothing unusual. Just the same brown comforter, the same faded walls, the same industrial carpet. But the indentation remained at the foot of the bed, and the crease in the sheet seemed even more pronounced under the direct illumination. I got up and walked to the window, pulling back one corner of the heavy curtain. The parking lot stretched empty under a few scattered streetlights. My rental car sitting alone beside a rusted pickup truck and a motorcycle covered with a blue tarp. Nothing moved except for the occasional moth circling the nearest light fixture. The bathroom mirror reflected my pale face as I splashed cold water against my cheeks, trying to wash away the paranoia that felt like spider webs clinging to my thoughts. Just stress, I told myself. Too much coffee, too little sleep, too many disappointments compressed into too few days. The mind plays tricks when pushed to its limits. But when I returned to the bed, the depression at the foot seemed deeper, more defined. I pressed my own hand into the mattress beside it, comparing the shapes. My fingers left their own temporary marks that quickly faded as the foam recovered. But the original impression remained constant, as if something far heavier than flesh and bone had created it. I tried sleeping with the lamp on, but the amber light created shadows that moved with every slight shift of the curtains. I tried sleeping in darkness, but every creak of the building settling, every distant sound from the highway, sent electricity shooting through my nervous system. Somewhere around 3 a.m, I gave up the pretense and sat up against the headboard, staring at that impossible handprint in the mattress. The rational part of my mind worked overtime, constructing explanations. Maybe the previous guest had been particularly heavy. Maybe the mattress was old and worn in exactly the right pattern. Maybe my exhausted brain was interpreting random indentations as something meaningful, the way people see faces in clouds or hear voices in static. But rationality couldn't explain the way the depression seemed to deepen as I watched it, or how the crease in the sheet appeared to shift slightly when I wasn't looking directly at it. It couldn't account for the sensation of breath on the back of my neck when I turned away from the window, or the feeling that something large and patient was studying me with the same intensity that I was studying the evidence of its presence. Dawn arrived with painful slowness, gray light gradually replacing the amber glow of the table lamp. I showered quickly, avoiding eye contact with my reflection, and packed my bag with mechanical efficiency. The desk clerk, a tired-looking woman with elaborate nail art and skeptical eyes, barely glanced up when I returned the key. "Everything satisfactory?" she asked, the question so routine it barely qualified as communication. I started to nod, then hesitated. "Room 127, I said. "Has anyone else complained about unusual experiences?" Her fingers paused over the keyboard. "What kind of unusual experiences?" "Just sounds, disturbances." She studied my face for a moment, and I saw something flicker behind her professional indifference. Recognition, maybe, or understanding. "Sir, that room's been vacant for 3 weeks. You were our first guest to stay there since we had it renovated." The word hung between us, weighted with implications I didn't want to explore. Renovated how? But she'd already turned back to her computer screen, fingers clicking across keys with renewed focus. "Have a safe trip," she said, dismissing me with the finality of someone who'd shared more than she'd intended. I drove away from the Desert Rose Motel as the sun crested the mountains, painting the desert landscape in shades of amber and gold. In my rearview mirror, the building grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely, swallowed by the vast emptiness of Arizona morning. But as I merged onto the highway, adjusting my seat and settling in for the long drive ahead, I felt something that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. The passenger seat seemed to compress slightly, as if accepting the weight of an invisible companion. The air conditioning cycled on, stirring the air in a way that felt like controlled breathing. I reached for the radio, desperate for distraction, but my fingers stopped short of the dial. In the sudden silence, I could swear I heard it. The soft, patient sound of someone settling in for a long journey. Someone who'd decided that our brief encounter in room 127 was just the beginning of a much longer conversation. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, and I drove toward whatever waited at the end of it, no longer certain whether I was traveling alone. Story 3. The first thing that struck me about the basement apartment wasn't the musty smell or the low ceiling that made me duck instinctively. It was how the silence seemed to press against my eardrums like water at depth. I'd found the listing late, scrolling through Portland rentals while my connecting flight got delayed another 3 hours. The host's messages had been oddly formal, almost apologetic. The space is private and quiet. Previous guests have found it conducive to rest. The narrow staircase descended from a side entrance, separate from the main house above. My footsteps echoed strangely in the confined space, each sound seeming to linger longer than it should. The apartment itself was sparse but clean. A Murphy bed already pulled down, a small kitchenette, and a bathroom barely larger than an airplane lavatory. Everything smelled faintly of wood glue and industrial carpet cleaner, but it was the closet that dominated the space. Built into the far wall, it stretched nearly floor to ceiling. Its MDF doors painted the same beige as everything else. The metal handles caught the overhead light with an almost mirror-like shine, and I found myself staring at them longer than necessary while I unpacked my single suitcase. The work conference had been brutal. 12-hour days of presentations and networking that left my head buzzing with corporate buzzwords and forced enthusiasm. All I wanted was to collapse into unconsciousness. But as I settled into the unfamiliar bed, Portland's urban soundtrack filtered through the small windows near the ceiling. Car engines, distant voices, the occasional siren. All of it felt muffled, as if the basement existed in a pocket of reduced atmosphere. I'd been drifting toward sleep when I heard it the first time. A low rumble, almost subsonic, like a compressor cycling on. It seemed to emanate from behind the closet doors, steady and mechanical. I lay still, listening, trying to place the sound. HVAC systems often made noise, especially in older buildings retrofitted for rental income. The rumble continued for perhaps 30 seconds before fading to silence. Minutes passed. Just as my breathing began to deepen again, it returned. The same low, continuous growl. Not mechanical, I realized with a start. Too organic, too irregular in its subtle variations, like something breathing very slowly and deliberately. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The sound persisted, neither growing louder nor fading, as if whatever produced it had found its optimal volume and intended to maintain it indefinitely. There were no pauses for breath, no rhythm that suggested lungs filling and emptying. Just that steady, bass-heavy drone that seemed to vibrate through the floor and into the metal bed frame. Sleep became impossible. I found myself timing the intervals. Sometimes the sound lasted 2 minutes, sometimes 5. The gaps between episodes ranged from mere seconds to nearly a quarter hour. There was no pattern I could discern, no logic to guide my expectations. Each time silence returned, I'd begin to relax, only to tense again when the growling resumed. By 3 a.m., I'd convinced myself it had to be plumbing, old pipes, water pressure issues, maybe a sump pump in the crawl space behind the closet. I'd dealt with enough rental properties to know that basement utilities could produce all manner of strange noises. The rational explanation helped calm my nerves enough that I eventually dozed fitfully until morning. The conference's second day proved even more exhausting than the first. I returned to the basement apartment around 9 p.m., muscles aching and eyes gritty from staring at PowerPoint slides. The space felt smaller somehow, the ceiling lower, the walls closer. I attributed it to fatigue and the lingering effects of airline coffee. I showered in the cramped bathroom, letting hot water wash away the day's accumulated stress. The mirror above the sink had developed a fine crack since morning. Not a spider web, just a single hairline from corner to corner that I didn't remember seeing before. I stared at my reflection split in two, noting how the fluorescent light made my skin look waxy and pale. The closet drew my attention again as I prepared for bed. Those polished metal handles seemed to catch every photon of available light, creating twin beacons in my peripheral vision, no matter which direction I faced. I found myself glancing toward them repeatedly, as if expecting the doors to swing open on their own. They remained stubbornly closed. This time, I was ready when the sound began. I'd left my phone on the nightstand with a voice recording app open, determined to capture evidence of whatever was disturbing my sleep. The growling started just after midnight, the same low, continuous drone that seemed to emerge from within the closet itself, rather than from any space behind it. I hit record and waited, phone held toward the closet doors. The sound continued for nearly 4 minutes this time, never varying in pitch or intensity. When it finally stopped, I played back the recording with trembling fingers. Nothing but silence. I played it again, turning the volume to maximum. Still nothing. Just the faint hiss of digital compression and my own shallow breathing. Yet even as the recording played back empty air, I could still hear the growling in my memory with perfect clarity. Sleep came in fragments that night, broken by repeated episodes of the sound that my phone insisted didn't exist. Each time I'd wake to that steady rumble, I'd grab the device and try again, always with the same result. The technology betrayed no sign of the noise that seemed to resonate in my very bones. Thursday brought fresh complications. The conference attendees were showing signs of strain: too much coffee, too little sleep, too many hours of fluorescent lights and recycled air. But my exhaustion ran deeper. I caught myself staring at blank walls during presentations, losing track of conversations mid-sentence. Colleagues asked if I was feeling well, their voices seeming to reach me from a great distance. That afternoon, I decided to confront the host about the noise. Her response came within minutes. "I'm sorry you're experiencing discomfort. Previous guests haven't mentioned any sounds from the utility areas. Perhaps the building's HVAC system is cycling more frequently due to the weather?" The weather had been mild and stable for days. I pressed further, describing the low growling in detail. Her second message took longer to arrive. The closet space connects to a small storage area beneath the main house's stairs. It's possible you're hearing the upstairs tenants moving around. Old wood can transmit sound in unexpected ways, but the main house appeared vacant. I'd never seen lights in the windows above, never heard footsteps on the floors overhead. The entire property felt abandoned except for the basement space I occupied. That evening, I approached the closet with methodical determination. The metal handles felt ice cold under my palms despite the apartment's stuffiness. I pulled both doors open simultaneously, half expecting resistance. The interior was exactly as I'd first seen it: empty shelves, the smell of wood glue and industrial sealant. But now I noticed details that had escaped my initial inspection. Scratches in the MDF backing, too regular to be accidental. Parallel lines scored into the material at roughly shoulder height, as if something with claws had repeatedly tested the strength of the barrier. More disturbing was the temperature differential. The air inside the closet was noticeably cooler, almost clammy against my skin. I extended my hand toward the back wall and felt an unmistakable draft. Not the gentle circulation of HVAC, but a steady current of cold air that suggested an opening somewhere in the darkness beyond the shelves. I retrieved a flashlight from my luggage and aimed it into the closet's depths. The beam revealed a loose panel in the back wall, barely noticeable unless you knew to look for it. The wood around its edges was darker, as if frequently handled. Behind it, the light penetrated perhaps 2 feet into what appeared to be a narrow crawl space, before being swallowed by absolute darkness. The opening was roughly rectangular, its dimensions uncomfortably familiar. About the width of a human torso, tall enough for someone to squeeze through if they were determined enough, or desperate enough. I replaced the panel and closed the closet doors, but the knowledge of that hidden passage lingered like a taste I couldn't wash from my mouth. Someone had accessed that space recently and regularly. The question was whether they were entering from my side or emerging from somewhere deeper in the building's forgotten infrastructure. That night I moved the room's single chair against the closet doors. It was a pathetic barricade, but the gesture provided a psychological comfort that logic couldn't match. I lay in bed facing the closet, eyes adjusting to the darkness until I could make out the faint outline of the chair's back pressed against the handles. The growling began at 1:15 a.m. This time, I didn't reach for my phone. Instead, I watched the chair. The sound seemed louder, more present, as if whatever produced it had moved closer to my side of the wall. The low rumble filled the room like a physical presence, pressing against my chest and making my teeth ache with sympathetic vibration. The chair didn't move. Not visibly, anyway. But as I stared, I became convinced that its position was shifting incrementally. A millimeter here, a fraction there. The metal legs might have been sliding across the floor with movements too gradual for my eye to register, but persistent enough to accumulate into meaningful displacement. After 10 minutes, the sound stopped. I continued watching the chair, certain now that it sat several inches further from the closet doors than when I'd positioned it. But certainty and proof were different things, and the darkness played tricks with depth perception. I spent the remainder of the night in the bathroom, door locked, fluorescent light buzzing overhead. The harsh illumination felt like armor against whatever lurked in the apartment's darker corners. I dozed fitfully on the toilet seat, jerking awake every time my head nodded forward. Friday's conference sessions passed in a haze of barely suppressed anxiety. I found myself constantly checking my phone for messages from the host, though I hadn't sent any new inquiries. My hands shook when I reached for coffee cups, and I spilled cream on my shirt during the morning break. Colleagues maintained polite distance, perhaps sensing something volatile in my demeanor. The keynote speaker discussed emerging trends in data security, but his words seemed to reach me through layers of cotton. I kept thinking about that rectangular opening behind the loose panel, wondering what it would feel like to crawl through such a confined space. Would the walls press against your shoulders? Would you be able to turn around if you needed to retreat? Would you be able to see what was crawling toward you from the other direction? That afternoon, I made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. I would spend one more night in the basement apartment, but this time I would be prepared. I stopped at a hardware store and purchased a small LED headlamp, a package of zip ties, and a motion-activated trail camera, the kind hunters use to monitor deer paths. The clerk asked if I was planning a camping trip. I told him I was conducting an experiment. Back in the apartment, I set up the camera in the corner opposite the closet, angled to capture the entire wall. The device was designed to activate when it detected movement, recording 30 seconds of video before returning to standby mode. If something was entering the closet from behind, or if the doors were opening on their own, I would finally have proof. As evening deepened into night, I found myself speaking aloud to the empty room, as if narrating my actions for an unseen audience. I described the camera placement, the chair barricade, the persistent sound that seemed to exist only for my ears. My voice sounded strange in the confined space, too loud and too small simultaneously. The growling began earlier than usual, starting around 11:30 p.m. I lay rigid in bed, watching the tiny red light on the trail camera. It remained steady, indicating the device was armed and waiting. The sound continued for nearly 20 minutes this time, longer than any previous episode. The camera light never blinked. When silence finally returned, I waited another hour before retrieving the device. The LCD screen showed 0 recordings captured. According to the timestamp, the camera had been active and monitoring throughout the entire period when I had heard the growling, yet it had detected no movement worthy of documentation. I sat on the edge of the bed, camera in my hands, trying to reconcile the evidence of my senses with the technology's stubborn neutrality. Either the camera was malfunctioning, or the source of the sound was somehow beyond its detection capabilities. Or I was losing my grip on reality in ways I wasn't prepared to acknowledge. The fourth possibility was the one that frightened me most, that something was watching me just as carefully as I was watching it. Something intelligent enough to remain perfectly still while producing sounds I couldn't ignore. I spent the remaining hours until dawn, sitting in the chair I'd used to barricade the closet, facing the doors with the LED headlamp strapped to my forehead. The beam created a harsh circle of white light surrounded by impenetrable shadows. Every few minutes I would sweep the light across the room, checking corners and doorways for signs of intrusion. Nothing moved, nothing changed, Yet the sense of being observed grew stronger as the night progressed, until I felt certain that invisible eyes were cataloging my every gesture and expression. When pale morning light finally began filtering through the basement windows, I packed my belongings with mechanical efficiency. The conference had one more day, but I couldn't spend another night in that space. I would find a hotel room, even if it cost 3 times as much. As I loaded my suitcase, I noticed something that stopped me cold. The closet doors were open, not fully, but cracked apart by perhaps 2 inches. The metal handles caught the morning light like twin signals, just as they had every day since my arrival. But I remembered closing those doors, more than remembered. I could feel the tactile memory of my palms against the cold metal, the soft click as the magnetic catches engaged. I had definitely, absolutely closed them before attempting to sleep. I approached the closet with the same dread I might feel walking toward the edge of a cliff. The gap between the doors was perfectly uniform, as if they had been opened with deliberate precision. Through the narrow opening, I could see the empty shelves and smell the familiar wood glue odor. At the bottom of the closet, barely visible in the shadowed space near the back wall, lay a single object that hadn't been there before. A small LED bulb, the same type that had rolled across the floor and come to rest against my boot that first night when the lamp fell. But this bulb was different. Instead of the warm white glow I remembered, this one pulsed with a steady red light, like a heartbeat made visible. The rhythm matched exactly what I recalled of the mysterious growling, not the mechanical cycle of equipment, but the organic pattern of something alive and breathing. I backed away from the closet without touching the doors or the pulsing bulb. My hands shook as I grabbed my suitcase and headed for the staircase leading to street level. Behind me, I could swear I heard the softest whisper of movement, like fabric brushing against wood or skin sliding across a smooth surface. I never looked back. The conference ended without me. I caught the first available flight home and tried to forget the basement apartment, the growling that no one else could hear, and the red light that pulsed like something trying to communicate across an impossible distance. But sometimes, in the quiet moments just before sleep, I still hear it. That low, continuous rumble that might be machinery, or might be something else entirely. Something that learned the exact dimensions of my fear and decided to make it home. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see that narrow rectangular opening behind the loose panel, and I wonder what would have happened if I'd been brave enough, or foolish enough, to crawl through it and see where it led. I wonder if whatever lives in spaces like that is still looking for me, following the sound of my breathing through the walls of every building I enter, waiting for another basement, another closet, another chance to demonstrate that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. The red light pulse in my memory has never stopped blinking. 1, 2, 1, 2. Steady as a heartbeat, patient as something that has learned to count time in human fears rather than minutes or hours. Sometimes I think about calling the host, asking if the next guest heard anything unusual, but I know what the answer would be, and I know I wouldn't believe it either way. Some experiences are too personal to be shared, too precisely calibrated to one person's particular terrors to be reproduced for anyone else. The growling was mine alone, and somewhere in Portland, in a basement I'll never visit again, it's still waiting. Story 4. The headlamp's beam cuts through Montana darkness like a surgical blade, illuminating nothing but the weathered planks of the outhouse door. 2 a.m., and the October cold seeps through my jacket, through skin, settling somewhere deeper where warmth used to live. The hunting lease stretches endlessly around me. 200 acres of pine and shadow that my buddies and I have claimed for the past 8 years, though tonight it feels more like the wilderness has claimed us. My phone weighs heavy in my pocket as I push the door wider, the hinges protesting with a screech that seems to echo forever among the trees. The guys back at the cabin are probably passed out by now, empty beer bottles and poker chips scattered across the table like evidence of simpler times. Just an hour ago we were laughing about yesterday's missed shots. about how the deer seem smarter this year, about anything except the strange feeling that's been growing in my chest since sunset. The outhouse door hangs at that perfect angle, not quite closed, not quite open, and something about it strikes me as absurd enough to photograph. Maybe it's the beer talking, or maybe it's the need to share this moment of ridiculous vulnerability with people who understand that hunting isn't really about the killing anymore. It's about the escape, the ritual, the way civilization falls away until you remember what silence actually sounds like. I pull out my phone and frame the shot. Door ajar, darkness beyond. My headlamp casting harsh shadows across rough wood. The camera app loads with that soft digital whisper, and I tap the shutter button without really looking at the screen. The flash explodes like lightning trapped in a mason jar. For one brilliant frozen moment, the world turns white and black and silver. And in that moment, in the viewfinder's tiny rectangle, I see them. Two figures at the tree line, maybe 30 yards away. A man, tall and motionless, wearing what looks like a dark jacket with something bulky in the chest area. And in front of him, smaller, draped in fabric that catches the flash and throws it back like wet silk under streetlights. They stand perfectly still, as if they've been watching me long enough to become part of the landscape. My finger hovers over the send button before my brain fully processes what I've captured. Muscle memory takes over. The same instinct that makes you share a particularly good sunset or a deer track in fresh snow. The image uploads to our group chat with that satisfying swoosh, and the sending indicator begins its lazy spin. That's when I hear it. Vegetation giving way. Not the random crack of a branch settling or the scurry of some night creature, but the deliberate, measured sound of something large moving through the underbrush. The sound comes from behind me, from the opposite side of where I took the photograph, and it carries the weight of intention. I spin around, headlamp beam swinging wild, illuminating nothing but pine trunks and the cabin's distant yellow windows. The sending indicator continues its patient rotation, while my heart hammers against my ribs like something trying to break free. The smart thing would be to walk quickly back to the cabin. The smart thing would be to wake the others, to make jokes about spooked city boys and imagination running wild. Instead, I find myself looking back at the photograph on my phone screen, squinting at those two motionless figures that shouldn't exist at 2 a.m. in the middle of nowhere. The man's jacket definitely has something in it. A bulge that could be anything from a hunting rifle to camera equipment to nothing at all, depending on the angle and the shadows and how much you want to believe your eyes. The smaller figure is harder to make out, gender ambiguous, face lost in darkness. But that fabric, the way it shimmers with captured light, makes my skin crawl in a way I can't articulate. A message notification pings, then another. The guys are awake after all. Dude, what the hell is this? You see those people? Who goes camping at 2 a.m.? That's not camping gear. Look at how they're standing. I walk back toward the cabin, phone screen illuminating my path in brief intervals, each step feeling like progress toward sanity. But the sounds follow me. Not footsteps exactly. More like the systematic disturbance of forest floor, branches, undergrowth. Someone moving parallel to my path, staying just outside the reach of my light. The cabin door feels solid and real under my palm. Inside, 3 faces look up from phones, the poker table forgotten, and I realize that none of them were actually asleep when I went outside. The television flickers silently in the corner, casting blue shadows across walls decorated with 8 years' worth of hunting photos and inside jokes. "Where did you take this?" someone asks, though I can't tell who. The voices seem to come from underwater now, distant and distorted. I sink into my usual chair and feel the leather creak with familiar comfort. Just outside, by the outhouse. The words feel strange in my mouth, like I'm describing someone else's experience. There's nobody staying anywhere near here. Closest neighbor is 5 miles through heavy brush. I look at the photograph again. The man with the bulky jacket appears closer than I remember, though that might be the phone's small screen playing tricks. The smaller figure seems to have shifted position slightly, turned more toward the camera, but that's impossible. Photographs don't change. Maybe they're lost, someone suggests, but the words carry no conviction. People don't get lost wearing silk that gleams like water. The conversation continues around me while I study every pixel of the image. The more I look, the less sense it makes. The lighting is wrong. My headlamp should have created sharper shadows, should have revealed more detail. Instead, the figures seem to absorb light rather than reflect it, except for that impossible fabric that might not be fabric at all. A sound outside makes us all freeze. Not the systematic rustling from before, but a single deliberate impact against the cabin's exterior wall. Like someone knocking, except the sound comes from too high up, from where a window might be if this wall had windows. We sit in perfect silence, phones forgotten, listening to the kind of quiet that exists only in the deep wilderness. Another impact, this time on the opposite wall, then another on the wall behind me. The sounds move with purpose, circling the cabin with the methodical patience of something that has all the time in the world. "Game camera," someone whispers, though I'm not sure why we're whispering now. We should check the game camera. But I already know what the game camera will show. The same way I know that when we look at the photograph again in daylight, the figures will be gone. Not moved, not changed, but completely absent, leaving us to question whether they were ever there at all. The camera will have captured nothing but trees and shadows and the movement of branches in wind that none of us felt. The knocking stops as suddenly as it began, leaving behind a silence so complete it feels manufactured. Outside, the October night presses against the windows with the weight of winter still months away, and I realize I'm gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles have gone white. The photograph stares back at me, unchanging and impossible. Two figures that might have been people, might have been shadows, might have been nothing more than the brain's desperate attempt to find patterns in random darkness. The sending indicator has long since disappeared, replaced by timestamps and red receipts, concrete proof that something happened worth documenting. I close the photo and open the weather app instead, checking conditions I already know by heart. 38 degrees, clear skies, no wind. Perfect hunting weather. Perfect weather for seeing exactly what you expect to see and nothing more. But when I close my eyes, I can still see them, standing at the edge of comprehension, watching with the patience of things that exist between certainty and doubt. The man's jacket holds its secret cargo while the silk-wrapped figure turns slowly in my memory, revealing features that shift like smoke whenever I try to focus on them. The others have started talking again, voices gradually returning to normal volumes, theories and explanations flowing like water finding its level. Someone mentions stress, someone else suggests equipment malfunction, and gradually the photograph becomes nothing more than a curious anomaly to be filed away with other inexplicable moments that happen when civilization gets far enough away. I should feel relieved. Instead, I find myself listening for sounds outside the cabin, for the systematic disturbance of forest floor that follows its own logic. Tomorrow we'll pack up and drive back to lives that make sense, where photographs capture only what's actually there, and shadows stay where they're supposed to stay. But tonight, in this space between what we know and what we fear, the image persists. Two figures at the edge of everything, wearing patience like a second skin, waiting with the certainty of things that have already happened and the possibility of things that never will. The phone grows warm in my palm, and I realize I've been staring at the black screen for too long, seeing my own reflection staring back with eyes that look like they've witnessed something they shouldn't have. Outside, the Montana wilderness settles into the deep quiet that comes before dawn, and I wonder if those figures are still there, standing motionless at the tree line, waiting for the next flash of light to reveal what was always there, hidden in plain sight. I set the phone face down on the table and try to convince myself that some mysteries are better left unsolved. But even as sleep finally begins to pull me under, I know I'll be checking that photograph every day for the rest of my life, looking for changes that logic says can't happen, searching for proof that what I saw was real, or hoping perhaps that it wasn't. Story 5. The auction house in Providence smelled of old wood and forgotten decades. I'd come for salvage pieces, remnants of the city's industrial past that might speak to my sculptures. But it was the mannequin head that called to me from a dusty corner, nestled between rusted gears and moth-eaten fabric samples. Bisque porcelain, crackled like old paint on a weathered fence. The seller mentioned it had belonged to a downtown department store that closed in the 70s. The blue eyes, faded to the color of winter sky, seemed to track my movement as I circled the table. When I lifted it, the head felt heavier than expected, substantial in a way that made my palms sweat despite the October chill seeping through the warehouse walls. $30, the auctioneer called out, but I was already reaching for my wallet. Back in my studio, a converted carriage house behind my rented Victorian, I placed the head on the highest shelf, facing the brick wall. Something about those painted eyes made me uncomfortable, though I couldn't articulate why. The workshop stretched out behind it, filled with half-finished pieces and tools that caught the amber light filtering through grimy windows. Everything felt normal then, safe. The first morning, I noticed it had turned. Not dramatically. Maybe 15 degrees clockwise, just enough so that one eye caught the light from the hallway door. The cracked lips seemed to curve slightly upward, though that might have been the way shadows fell across the painted features. I repositioned it, this time pressing the base firmly against the wall, leaving a small indentation in the plaster. But the next morning brought the same subtle shift. Same angle, same gradual turn toward the corridor that led to my house. I started paying attention to details I'd previously ignored, the way dust motes danced in the shaft of light that fell across the shelf each afternoon around 3:30. How my footsteps echoed differently when I worked late, as if the space had grown larger in the darkness. The peculiar quality of silence that seemed to emanate from the mannequin's corner, thick and expectant. By the fourth day, I'd developed a routine of checking the head's position first thing each morning. Always the same rotation, always toward that hallway. I began measuring the distance from the wall, 1 inch, then 1.5 inches, then 2. The base left trails in the accumulated dust, perfect arcs that documented each nocturnal movement. The logical part of my mind offered explanations. Old buildings settle. Temperature changes cause materials to expand and contract. The floorboards weren't level, but logic felt thin and insubstantial against the growing certainty that something was fundamentally wrong with the thing I'd brought into my workspace. I tried securing it with fishing line, threading the transparent filament through the mannequin's hollow neck and anchoring it to a nail driven deep into the mortar between bricks. The line was rated for 20-pound test, stronger than necessary for a head that weighed maybe 3 pounds. The next morning, I found the line severed cleanly, as if cut with a razor. The head had moved its usual distance, but something else had changed. The layer of grime that had accumulated over decades seemed lighter across the cheeks and forehead. Not cleaned exactly, but disturbed, as if gentle fingers had traced the contours of the face. That evening, I remained in the studio past midnight, pretending to work on a welded steel piece while keeping the mannequin in my peripheral vision. The head sat motionless on its shelf, pale and serene under the harsh fluorescent lights. But I felt watched, a prickly sensation between my shoulder blades that made concentration impossible. Every few minutes, I found myself glancing toward the corner, expecting to catch some hint of movement. Nothing. Just painted eyes and cracked ceramic skin, and the growing certainty that my sanity was slowly fraying. I installed a motion sensor with a bright LED that would trigger if anything larger than a mouse moved in that corner of the room. For 3 nights, the light remained dark. Then I found it on the floor, shattered, with the mannequin turned its usual increment and wearing what I swear was a cleaner, more defined smile. The dream started around the same time. Always the same scenario. I'm working late, focused on some intricate detail, when peripheral vision catches movement. But when I turn, the mannequin faces the wall as it should. Still, the feeling persists, of being studied, evaluated, perhaps found wanting. In the dreams, the corridor stretches impossibly long, and footsteps echo from its depths, though I never see their source. I wake with the taste of dust in my mouth and the certainty that something has been breathing on my face while I slept. During daylight hours, rationality reasserted itself. I researched the store where the mannequin had originally lived, digging through newspaper archives and city records. Gimbel's department store, established 1923, closed permanently in 1974, after a fire in the basement damaged the building's foundation. No deaths reported, but several employees claimed the store felt watched in its final months of operation. The head's nocturnal migrations continued with mechanical precision. Always the same distance, always the same angle. I began documenting everything: photographs, measurements, detailed notes about environmental conditions. The evidence was undeniable. Something was moving the mannequin, something that left no other traces of its presence, except for the face. Each morning, another layer of accumulated grime had been disturbed. First the cheeks, then the forehead, then around the eyes. Careful attention, almost tender. The blue paint seemed brighter now, more vivid, as if whatever was touching it was somehow restoring the original pigments. I brought in a colleague, Dr. Thornfield from the university's art history department. He examined the piece with professional interest, noting the craftsmanship and probable date of manufacture, but showed no reaction to what I considered obvious anomalies. When I pointed out the dust patterns and the precise markings on the shelf, he suggested I might be experiencing stress-related hypervigilance. Old buildings are full of subtle movements, he said, running his fingers along the mannequin's smooth cheek. Foundation settling, humidity changes, vibrations from passing traffic. The mind tends to impose patterns on random events, especially when we're working in isolation. But that night, after he'd gone, I noticed fresh fingerprints in the dust beside where his hand had touched the ceramic surface. Not his prints. These were smaller, more delicate, and they appeared to be reaching toward the mannequin from underneath the shelf. I stopped sleeping in the house. Instead, I hauled a cot into the studio and positioned it directly across from the mannequin's perch. If something was moving it, I would catch it in the act. I kept a camera ready, loaded with high-speed film that could capture movement in low-light conditions. For a week, nothing happened. The head remained motionless, facing the wall exactly as I positioned it each evening. I began to feel foolish, wondering if Dr. Thornfield was right about stress and isolation. Maybe I'd been working too many late nights, drinking too much coffee, allowing my imagination to transform ordinary settling sounds into something sinister. Then, on a particularly cold Thursday in November, I dozed off around 2 a.m. I woke to the sensation of being watched. Not the vague paranoia I'd grown accustomed to, but the specific, unmistakable feeling of eyes focused intently on my face. The studio was dark except for moonlight streaming through the windows, casting long shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The mannequin was gone. Not moved, gone entirely. The shelf sat empty except for a light coating of dust and the familiar arc-shaped marks that documented months of gradual rotation. My first instinct was to check the floor, thinking it might have fallen, but there was no sign of broken porcelain anywhere in the room. I grabbed a flashlight and searched every corner, every shelf, every possible hiding place. Nothing. The mannequin head had simply vanished, as if it had never existed at all. But in the corridor, the long hallway that connected my studio to the main house, I found footprints in the dust. Not mine. These were smaller, more delicate, and they led from the studio doorway to the foot of the stairs that rose into the darkened upper floors of the house. Alongside the footprints, trailing parallel, were drag marks. Something round and heavy had been pulled along the wooden floor, leaving a distinctive groove in the accumulated grime. I followed the trail upstairs, flashlight beam dancing across cracked plaster walls and peeling wallpaper that previous tenants had never bothered to replace. The footprints led to the master bedroom, my bedroom, and stopped at the foot of my bed. There, on my pillow, sat the mannequin head. It faced the door, blue eyes bright and alert in the flashlight's glare, painted lips curved in what was unmistakably a smile. But this wasn't the gentle, distant expression I'd grown used to. This was knowing, almost predatory, as if it had been waiting patiently for me to discover it. The ceramic surface was completely clean now, all traces of decades-old grime removed to reveal the original craftsmanship in perfect detail. Every subtle variation in the blue paint of the eyes was visible. Every delicate line of the lips stood out in sharp relief. It looked almost alive, more real than it had any right to be. I stood frozen in the doorway, afraid to enter my own bedroom, afraid to touch the thing that had somehow transported itself 20 feet and up a flight of stairs. The rational part of my mind insisted there had to be an explanation. Sleepwalking, perhaps, or some elaborate practical joke orchestrated by someone with access to my house. But the footprints were too small to be mine, and I lived alone. I spent the rest of the night in my car, parked in the driveway with the engine running and the heater blasting against the November cold. Through the bedroom window, I could see the mannequin's silhouette against the far wall, motionless now but somehow expectant, as if it was waiting for my return. Morning brought no relief. The head remained on my pillow, still wearing that knowing smile, still radiating a presence that made the hair on my arms stand on end. I called in sick to the college where I taught part-time sculpture classes, claiming a family emergency that wasn't entirely untrue. I needed help, but who would believe me? Dr. Thornfield had already dismissed my concerns as stress-related delusions. The police would assume I was having some kind of breakdown. Even calling a priest seemed absurd. What exactly would I tell him? That a mannequin head had developed the ability to move independently and seemed to be taking an uncomfortably personal interest in my sleeping arrangements. Instead, I did research. The Providence Public Library's archives contained more information about Gimbel's department store than I'd found online. Newspaper clippings from the early 70s mentioned not just the fire that closed the store, but a series of unexplained incidents in the months leading up to the closure. Customers complained about feeling watched while shopping. Several children became hysterical in the toy department, claiming the dolls were looking at them. 3 different window dressers quit within a 2-week period, all citing the same reason. The mannequins seemed to move when no one was looking. The final straw came when the night security guard found all the mannequins in the women's clothing section turned to face the store's main entrance. He swore he'd positioned them normally at the start of his shift, but by morning they'd formed a semicircle around the front door, as if waiting for something to arrive. The fire happened 3 days later. I drove back to the auction house where I'd purchased the head, but the building was locked up tight with a "for lease" sign in the window. The neighboring businesses had no information about the previous tenant, though one shop owner mentioned hearing sounds from the empty building at night, footsteps and what sounded like objects being moved around. By the time I returned home, it was nearly dark. The mannequin head sat exactly where I'd left it, but something in the bedroom had changed. The air felt different, thicker, more charged, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. And there was a scent I hadn't noticed before, faint but distinctly floral, as if someone had been wearing perfume from a distant decade. That's when I noticed the other footprints. Not just the small, delicate ones I'd found leading upstairs, but a second set, larger and more recent. These led from the bedroom to the hallway window that overlooked the backyard. When I followed them, I found the window open despite the November chill, curtains moving gently in the breeze. Outside, barely visible in the gathering darkness, more footprints crossed the yard toward the carriage house, toward my studio. 2 sets now, walking side by side, as if the mannequin head had found a companion. I should have left then, should have packed a bag, driven to a hotel, maybe caught the first flight to somewhere warm and far away from Providence and its increasingly active population of ceramic observers. Instead, I found myself walking toward the studio, flashlight in one hand and my phone in the other, thumb hovering over the emergency call button. The studio door stood open. Inside, every sculpture I'd been working on had been turned to face the entrance. 23 pieces, from small clay studies to massive welded installations, all oriented toward the doorway like an audience waiting for a performance. And there, on the highest shelf where the mannequin head had spent so many weeks gradually rotating toward my workspace, sat something new. Another mannequin head, this one with green eyes and auburn hair painted in careful detail. Female, younger looking than my original find, with the same knowing smile and the same impossible sense of awareness. Beside it, my familiar blue-eyed observer seemed almost restrained by comparison. The footprints led directly to the shelf, then stopped. I stood in the doorway, afraid to enter, afraid to leave, afraid to move at all. The studio felt different now. Not just watched, but crowded, as if invisible presences filled every corner. The air hummed with an energy that made my skin crawl and my vision blur around the edges. Both mannequin heads faced me directly, and I would swear their eyes tracked my movement as I shifted nervously from foot to foot. The green-eyed newcomer's smile seemed particularly predatory, while my original find wore an expression that might have been satisfaction or possession. I backed away slowly, keeping both heads in sight until I reached my car. The engine turned over on the third try, and I reversed down the driveway without looking back. In my rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of lights in the studio windows. Soft, warm illumination that I definitely hadn't left on. I'm writing this from a motel room 50 miles outside the city. Tomorrow I'll call a real estate agent and put the house on the market. Tonight, I'm trying to convince myself that stress and isolation finally caught up with me, that everything I've experienced has a rational explanation rooted in psychology rather than the supernatural. But I can't explain the photos on my phone. Dozens of images I don't remember taking, all showing the same two mannequin heads in various positions throughout my house. In the kitchen, facing each other across the breakfast table. In the living room, positioned on either side of my reading chair. In the bathroom, reflected in the mirror above the sink. And in the most recent photo, taken apparently just an hour ago according to the timestamp, both heads sit on my motel room's dresser. They're facing the bed. The green-eyed one's smile looks wider now, more confident, while my original find seems content to watch and wait. On the nightstand beside them, my room key sits next to a small pile of ceramic dust, the kind that might accumulate when someone carefully cleans decades of grime from a delicate porcelain surface. I haven't been back to the room since I went out for coffee 2 hours ago. I can see them through the window, pale and motionless under the motel's harsh fluorescent lighting. But every few minutes I swear the green-eyed head turns slightly, just enough to maintain eye contact as I pace the parking lot. The desk clerk won't answer my calls, and the other rooms all appear empty despite the full parking lot. My car won't start, though the engine was running fine when I arrived. And somewhere behind me, I can hear footsteps on asphalt. Light, careful steps that stop whenever I turn around. I'm starting to understand that distance might not be the solution I'd hoped for. The mannequin heads aren't just moving now. They're following. And each time they relocate themselves, they seem to bring more friends. Story 6. The key still felt foreign in my palm 3 weeks after the funeral, its brass surface worn smooth by decades of my grandmother's fingers. The Albany apartment stretched before me, cramped and cluttered, smelling of lavender sachets and something else, something stale and patient that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. I'd been putting off this task, finding excuses to delay the inevitable sorting through of her possessions. But the estate lawyer had been calling, and the building management had started leaving increasingly curt notes about clearing the unit. Time was running out, and I could no longer postpone what felt like an archaeological dig through the life of someone I'd barely known. The afternoon light filtered through yellowed curtains, casting everything in sepia tones. Boxes lined the hallway. Donations, keep, discard. The familiar categories of grief, each one a small betrayal of the person who once called this place home. I'd been working methodically through the main rooms, but there was one door I hadn't opened yet. The room at the end of the narrow hallway had always been closed during my infrequent childhood visits. When I'd asked about it, grandmother would wave dismissively and change the subject. Storage, she'd say, or sometimes just nothing important. The doorknob sat loose in its housing, wobbling slightly when touched, and the paint around the frame looked newer than the rest of the apartment, cleaner, whiter, as if someone had recently tried to seal something in. Standing before it now, I felt an odd reluctance. My hand hovered over the knob, and for reasons I couldn't articulate, I knocked instead. 3 sharp raps with my knuckles. The response came immediately, 3 soft taps from the other side, so light they might have been the settling of old wood. But the timing was too precise, too deliberate. I stepped back, heart hammering against my ribs. Old buildings make sounds, pipes expand, floorboards creak. I'd heard similar things all afternoon as I worked, the apartment seeming to comment on my intrusion with sighs and whispers. This was no different. I tried the knob. Locked. The building superintendent, a perpetually grease-stained man who'd introduced himself as Kowalski, had given me a ring of keys along with grandmother's primary set. None of them fit the lock. When I called down to ask about it, his voice carried an edge of irritation. Your grandmother never wanted that room opened. Made that clear from day one. If it's locked, it stays locked. But I was family. I had rights, and the estate needed to be settled completely. I'll need a locksmith then. Good luck with that. The line went dead. The first locksmith I called took one look at the door and shook his head. Can't help you. Got explicit instructions on my system not to service this address. The second gave the same response, almost word for word. By the fourth call, I wasn't surprised by the refusal, but the consistency of their answers troubled me, as if they'd all been reading from the same script. That evening, alone in the apartment as I sorted through grandmother's correspondence, I found the papers. Buried in a manila folder labeled Building Management, I discovered a series of exchange letters dating back nearly 15 years. Request after request for lock replacement, all denied. The building's responses grew increasingly terse over the years, culminating in a final memo that made my skin crawl. Responding sounds not a maintenance issue. No further requests will be acknowledged. Responding sounds. I returned to the door, drawn by a compulsion I didn't fully understand. The hallway seemed longer in the evening light, shadows stretching like fingers toward my feet. I knocked again. 3 times, deliberate and clear. The answer came softer than before, but undeniably present. 3 gentle taps that seemed to emanate not from the wood itself, but from somewhere deeper, more distant. As if the sound traveled through layers of space I couldn't see. Over the following days, I found myself returning to that door repeatedly. Each visit followed the same pattern: 3 knocks, 3 responses. But only when I was alone. Only when I was calm. If I approached the door angry or frustrated, nothing happened. If someone else was in the apartment, the occasional neighbor checking on my progress, or Kowalski making his rounds, the door remained silent. It wanted something specific from me: privacy, patience, a particular state of mind. I began to experiment. Different numbers of knocks yielded different responses. 2 knocks received 2 in return. 4 brought 4. But there was a rhythm to it, an intelligence that made my pulse quicken. When I knocked rapidly, the response came slowly. When I paused between knocks, it matched my timing perfectly. The sound itself began to change too. What had initially seemed like the settling of old wood now carried distinct characteristics. Sometimes hollow, as if echoing through an empty space. Other times muffled, as if filtered through fabric or earth. And occasionally, this frightened me most, the responding knocks came in patterns I hadn't initiated, complex rhythms that sounded almost like conversation. I found myself listening for the door even when I wasn't near it. Working in the living room, I'd pause mid-task, convinced I'd heard those soft taps coming from down the hall. But when I investigated, the hallway remained empty and silent. The door waited, patient and unmoving. My sleep grew fitful. Dreams of locked rooms and hidden spaces filled my nights. I'd wake convinced I'd heard knocking, only to find myself alone in grandmother's old bedroom. Moonlight streaming through windows that faced an alley filled with nothing but dumpsters and fire escapes. During the day, I called locksmiths further from Albany, hoping distance might break whatever hold the local companies seemed to be under. But each call ended the same way: polite refusals, suggestions to contact other services, and always that strange uniformity of response, as if they were all protecting the same secret. On my 7th day in the apartment, I discovered something that changed everything. Hidden behind a loose baseboard in the kitchen, I found a journal. My grandmother's handwriting filled page after page, dating back to her first week in the apartment. The early entries were mundane: complaints about noisy neighbors, observations about the building's quirks. But gradually, the tone shifted. The room at the end responds to me now. 3 knocks, always 3, like it's learning. Tried different patterns today. It copies everything perfectly. How is that possible? Old wood doesn't echo with such precision. The building manager came by, says other tenants have complained about sounds from my unit, but I know they can't hear it. Only happens when I'm alone, when I'm quiet inside. It knows when I'm ready to listen. The entries grew increasingly erratic. Grandmother described conversations, actual conversations, conducted entirely through knocks. She'd developed an elaborate code, she claimed, a way to communicate with whatever waited behind the door. The journal detailed her attempts to understand its nature, its purpose. It's not trying to get out. That's what I thought at first. Something trapped wanting freedom. But it's not that. It wants to get in. Not into the room. Into me. Into my understanding. It has something to show me. Tried the locksmith again today. Third one this month. They all refuse. But I understand now why the door stays locked. Some barriers aren't meant to protect us from what's on the other side. They protect what's on the other side from us, from our world, our rules. The final entries were barely legible, grandmother's handwriting deteriorating into desperate scratches. The knocks come even when I don't initiate them now. Patterns I've never heard before. Complex, beautiful, terrifying. It's teaching me something, showing me how thin the walls really are between spaces, between what we see and what simply is. Can't sleep. The conversation never stops. Even when I'm not at the door, I hear it, feel it. The responding doesn't come from the room anymore. It comes from inside, from the parts of me that have learned to listen properly. Today I knocked 13 times. It knocked back 13 times, but then it continued. 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, and stopped. Today is my 21st day in this apartment. It's counting, has been counting all along. The journal ended there, mid-page, as if grandmother had simply put down the pen and walked away. I checked the dates. She'd lived in the apartment for 47 years. That night I dreamed of knocking. Not the soft taps I'd grown accustomed to, but thunderous pounding that shook the walls and rattled the windows. I woke to silence, but the dream's urgency lingered. Something was different. Standing in the hallway, I approached the door with newfound trepidation. The air felt thicker here, charged with potential. I raised my hand to knock, then hesitated. In the journal, grandmother had mentioned something about counting, about the door somehow tracking time, marking days. How long had I been coming here? How many times had I knocked? I tried to remember but found the days blurring together. Had it been a week? 2 weeks? The rhythm of knock and response had become so natural, so expected, that I'd stopped thinking about it as strange. It simply was. With growing unease, I knocked once. The response came immediately, but different now, stronger, more present, as if whatever waited on the other side had grown closer to the barrier between us. I backed away, but my feet remained rooted to the worn carpet. The door seemed larger somehow, dominating the narrow hallway. The loose doorknob caught the light strangely, and for a moment, just a moment, I could have sworn I saw it turn slightly, as if someone on the other side was testing its movement. But that was impossible. The door was locked. Had always been locked. I retreated to the living room but found no peace there. The apartment felt different, smaller. The walls seemed closer, the ceiling lower. Even the familiar clutter of grandmother's possessions appeared foreign now, as if I were seeing them through different eyes. Through eyes that had learned to notice things they'd previously overlooked. The responding had changed me, just as it had changed her. That realization should have terrified me, but instead I felt an odd sense of completion. Understanding. The door hadn't been trying to communicate with me at all. It had been training me, teaching me to listen, to respond, to become something that could properly interface with whatever waited on the other side. I found myself walking back down the hallway, my movement automatic and calm. The door waited, patient as always, but now I could see. Really see how the paint around the frame wasn't just newer, it was different, applied not to refresh, but to reinforce, to strengthen a barrier that was wearing thin. I raised my hand and knocked 3 times. The response came from everywhere at once, not from the door, but from the walls, the ceiling, the floor beneath my feet, the entire apartment responding in perfect unison. And I understood with crystal clarity that the locked room had never been the source. The room was empty, had always been empty. The responding came from the spaces between spaces, the gaps in reality that most people never notice because they've never learned to listen properly. Grandmother had spent 47 years learning. I'd spent... how long? Time felt negotiable now, flexible. I knocked again, but this time I wasn't alone in the hallway. I could sense grandmother beside me, her presence as real as my own. And behind her, others, previous tenants, previous listeners. All of us gathered in the space that existed between knock and response, between question and answer. The loose doorknob turned slowly, finally giving way. The door swung open, revealing nothing but darkness. Not the darkness of an unlit room, but the darkness of space that hadn't decided what it wanted to become yet. I stepped forward, and my foot found solid ground that shouldn't have existed. The darkness welcomed me, and I understood why the locksmith had refused to come, why the building manager had stopped responding to grandmother's requests, why the door had needed to stay locked. Some barriers aren't meant to keep things out. They're meant to keep things in, until those things learn to open doors from the inside. Story 7. The house changed frequency the night he came home. I should have known something was different when the filament bulbs in the kitchen started their staccato dance. Clean, millisecond cuts of darkness that felt too precise, too deliberate. Not the gradual dimming of dying electricity, but sharp interruptions that reminded me of Morse code I couldn't decipher. The timing was wrong, the pattern too intentional. He'd been gone for 6 weeks. 6 weeks in the psych ward at Regions Hospital in St. Paul, where they'd fed him pills that dulled the edges of whatever had been eating at him from the inside. When I picked him up that Tuesday morning, he seemed smaller somehow, as if the building had compressed him into a more manageable version of himself. The drive home was quiet except for the radio static that hadn't been there before, white noise that seemed to follow us through every station. "Did you change anything in the house?" he asked as we pulled into the driveway. I hadn't touched anything except to keep it clean, to maintain the illusion that normal life was waiting for his return. But the question lingered in the air between us like smoke, and I found myself studying the familiar angles of our home as if seeing it for the first time. The first night, I attributed the TV's behavior to our aging cable box. The screen would freeze mid-scene, casting stark shadows that looked like negative impressions of people standing in our living room, dark silhouettes that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them, peripheral phantoms that vanished the moment I turned my head. I'd restart the system, and everything would return to normal for 20 minutes before freezing again, always in the same way, always with those shadowy figures pressed against the glass like memories trying to break through. He noticed too, but didn't comment. Just watched from the couch with that new stillness he'd brought back from the hospital, his hands folded in his lap, like a patient waiting for test results. The second night, the phrases started. They arrived in my head fully formed, complete sentences that felt foreign against my thoughts. Not my voice, not my words, but somehow spoken in my mental accent. The frequency is already here. It followed him home. You invited it in when you said yes to loving someone broken. I'd snap awake at 2 a.m., heart racing, convinced someone had whispered directly into my ear, but the room would be empty except for his sleeping form beside me, breathing steady and deep in a way that seemed almost theatrical in its normalcy. The digital clock would read 3:07, always 3:07, as if time itself had gotten stuck on that particular moment. By the third night, I was documenting everything: times, temperatures, the exact nature of each occurrence. The methodical approach helped maintain the thin veneer of rationality I was desperately clinging to. Scientific observation instead of supernatural speculation. There had to be explanations. Electromagnetic interference, faulty wiring, the stress of his return affecting my perception. But then, the knife happened. I was making coffee Thursday morning when I heard the sound. A clean thunk like a dart hitting a board. I turned to find my largest kitchen knife embedded point first in the granite countertop, standing perfectly vertical, as if it had been placed there with surgical precision. The stone showed no chips, no cracks, just a small circular hole around the blade that seemed to go deeper than physics should allow. The knife had been in the wooden block on the other side of the kitchen. I'd used it the night before to slice an apple, washed it, returned it to its designated slot. There was no logical path from the block to the counter, no trajectory that made sense. Yet there it stood, quivering slightly as if it had just arrived. He walked into the kitchen while I was staring at it, and his expression didn't change. No surprise, no concern, just that same patient waiting look he'd been wearing since his return. "It's starting again," he said quietly, and I realized this wasn't the first time he'd witnessed something like this. That afternoon, I called a team of investigators, not paranormal researchers, but electrical specialists who dealt with interference issues, professional skeptics with expensive equipment who could provide rational explanations for what was happening to our home. I told them about the flickering lights, the TV problems, the knife incident. I didn't mention the phrases in my head or the 307 wake-ups. They arrived Friday evening with oscilloscopes and EMF detectors, digital recorders and thermal cameras. Serious men with serious tools who spoke in technical terms about wiring configurations and magnetic field fluctuations. I felt relief watching them work, convinced they'd find loose connections or faulty grounds, something fixable, something normal. What they found instead were the convergences. Starting at 3:07 a.m., their equipment registered low-frequency hums emanating from multiple points throughout the house. Not one source, but several, all operating on the same wavelength, all synchronized with mechanical precision. The basement, the attic, the walls between rooms. Every recording device picked up the same sub-audible drone, a frequency just below the threshold of conscious hearing, but loud enough to register on their instruments. "We've never seen anything like this," the lead investigator admitted, playing back the audio files the next morning. "It's like your house has become a resonating chamber tuned to a specific pitch, but there's no obvious source generating the sound." I watched the waveforms on his laptop screen, perfect sine waves that started and stopped with atomic precision, lasting exactly 11 minutes before fading into silence. The pattern repeated every hour between 3:07 and sunrise, then disappeared completely during daylight hours. After they left, the house felt different. Not quieter, the opposite. As if their documentation had somehow legitimized whatever was happening, given it permission to be more present, more obvious. The bulbs flickered more frequently. The TV shadows grew darker and more defined, and the phrases in my head became conversations I couldn't quite follow. "He's the antenna now. You can hear us because you're connected to him. The frequency doesn't stop. It just finds new receivers." I started sleeping in the guest room, telling myself it was to avoid disturbing his recovery. But really, I needed distance from whatever field of influence seemed to surround him. The guest room was quieter, less affected by the convergences, though I could still feel them vibrating through the walls. A rhythmic pulse like a massive heartbeat buried in the foundation. He began staying awake later, sitting in the living room in the dark, facing the TV even when it wasn't on. Sometimes I'd watch him from the guest room doorway, and his stillness was so complete, it looked like he was listening to something only he could hear. When I asked what he was doing, he'd turn slowly, his eyes taking a moment to focus on me as if I'd interrupted a deep conversation. "They're trying to explain," he'd say, "but the language is wrong. They need to adjust the frequency." The rational part of my mind cataloged his words as symptoms, potential indications that his medication needed adjustment. But another part, a part that had been growing stronger since the convergences started, wondered if he was receiving something I couldn't access. Transmission from a source that required a particular kind of damage to decode. Week 2 brought physical changes to the house itself. Doors that had hung straight for 15 years now sat slightly askew in their frames. Windows reflected images that didn't match what stood before them, sometimes showing empty rooms when we were clearly visible, sometimes revealing additional figures that cast no shadows in the actual space. The hardwood floors developed a particular creak pattern, always in the same sequence, as if invisible footsteps were wearing familiar paths through our home. I measured everything: door angles, window positions, floor temperatures. The changes were real, documented, quantifiable. But they followed no pattern of settling or structural damage. Instead, they seemed purposeful, deliberate, as if the house was slowly reshaping itself to accommodate new residents. The frequency was strongest in his presence. When he left for therapy appointments or medical checkups, the convergences would fade to barely detectable whispers. The TV would display normal images, the lights would burn steady, and the phrases in my head would quiet to occasional murmurs. But the moment his car pulled into the driveway, everything would amplify, as if his proximity somehow boosted the signal strength. I began to understand that whatever he'd encountered during his breakdown, whatever had necessitated his stay at Regions, had followed him home. Not attached to him exactly, but drawn by the particular frequency of his damaged neural patterns, using him as a kind of lighthouse to navigate into our reality. The investigation team returned for a second visit, bringing additional equipment and a growing sense of professional excitement. The convergences had evolved, becoming more complex, more layered. Instead of simple sine waves, their recordings now captured what sounded like overlapping voices speaking in frequencies just below human perception. Computer analysis revealed patterns within the noise, repeating phrases, rhythmic structures that suggested language rather than random interference. "It's almost like radio transmissions," the lead investigator explained, "but broadcasting from inside the walls themselves, as if your house has become a receiver for signals that aren't coming from any terrestrial source." That night, I dreamed I was standing in our living room, but the space extended infinitely in all directions. The familiar furniture floated like islands in an ocean of static air, and I could see figures moving between them, translucent people who seemed to be searching for something they'd lost. When I woke at 3:07, the dream didn't fade. Instead, it lingered in my peripheral vision, as if the room I was seeing existed parallel to the one I was physically occupying. He was sitting on the edge of our bed, head tilted like he was listening to distant music. "Can you hear them now?" he asked without turning around. I could. Faint whispers threading through the convergence frequency, words in a language that felt familiar despite being completely foreign, not threatening exactly, but insistent, like voices calling across a vast distance, trying to make contact with anyone who might be listening. "What do they want?" He was quiet for a long time, and when he finally answered, his voice carried the same patient waiting quality that had become his default expression. "To come through," he said. "They've been trying for a long time, but they needed the right kind of receiver, someone broken in exactly the right way." I realized then that the hospital hadn't cured him, it had tuned him. Whatever therapy and medication they'd administered had accidentally adjusted his mental frequency to match something that had been broadcasting from the spaces between spaces, looking for a mind damaged enough to serve as a conduit. The house wasn't haunted, it was receiving. As I write this, it's 3:06 a.m. The convergences will begin in 60 seconds, and I can already feel the familiar tingling in my skull that announces the arrival of voices that aren't quite voices, words that aren't quite words. He's downstairs in the living room, sitting perfectly still in front of the dark TV, serving as antenna for transmissions from someplace else. I don't know if what's happening is supernatural or the result of shared psychosis, electromagnetic interference, or neurological damage that we both somehow sustained. I don't know if the investigators' recordings capture actual phenomena or the audio equivalent of hallucinations. I don't know if the house is changing or if we're losing our ability to perceive it correctly. What I know is that the frequency is getting stronger, the convergences lasting longer, and the spaces between our reality and whatever lies beneath it growing thinner. I know that sometimes I catch glimpses of those shadowy figures from the TV screen standing in my actual peripheral vision, and I'm no longer certain which version of the room is real. I know that when I look at him, really look, sometimes his edges seem to blur, as if he's becoming something more than human, something that exists partially in our frequency and partially in theirs. And I know that tonight, for the first time, the voices in my head spoke in perfect English. Thank you for letting us in. We've been waiting so long to come home. The convergence is starting now. 3:07 exactly. I can hear them gathering. Story 8. The studio breathes differently at 3 in the morning. Not the shallow, conscious respirations of daylight hours when clients shuffle through with their demos and desperate hopes, but something deeper, a slow, deliberate rhythm that seems to emanate from the building's bones. I've grown accustomed to its cadence over these past 18 months. The way the walls expand imperceptibly with each distant truck rumble on State Street. How the vinyl flooring contracts with the cooling night air, producing tiny pops and creaks that punctuate my solitary work sessions. Tonight feels different, though I can't articulate why. The same fluorescent hums above my mixing console, casting the same sterile white glow across banks of equipment and tangled cables. The same coffee grows cold in the same chipped mug beside my mechanical keyboard, a relic from better days when I could afford upgrades. Its switches worn smooth by countless late-night email exchanges, with labels that would never call back. I'm responding to another rejection when it happens. The K key, always the troublesome one, slightly loose from my tendency to strike it too hard during frustrated typing sessions, suddenly pops free from its housing. The small plastic square arcs through the stale air and lands with a sharp click on the vinyl floor, skittering toward the hallway that leads to the building's main corridor. Nothing unusual there. These old mechanical keyboards shed keycaps like autumn leaves, and I've performed this particular rescue operation dozens of times. I finish typing my response, something polite about understanding their position and hoping for future opportunities, and push back from the desk. My chair wheels squeak against the floor, a sound that always makes me wince in the profound silence. The keycap rests about 6 feet away, just beyond the pool of fluorescent light that spills from my studio into the darkened hallway. I can make out its pale surface against the darker vinyl, a tiny beacon calling me away from my work. Standing, I stretch muscles cramped from hours of hunching over the mixing board, vertebrae popping in sequence like bubble wrap. 3 steps toward the hallway, 2 more to reach the edge of light. Then I hear them. 2 distinct clicks, sharp and metallic, echoing from the shadows ahead. Not the soft plastic on vinyl sound of the falling keycap, but something more purposeful. The precise mechanical snap of a switch engaging. The same sound the K key makes when I press it properly into place. I freeze, 1 foot still raised mid-step. The keycap moves. Not rolls exactly, because there's no visible force acting upon it. No breeze in this sealed building, no vibration from passing traffic. It simply slides. A smooth, deliberate glide across the vinyl surface, traveling in a perfectly straight line until it comes to rest against the toe of my right sneaker, with that familiar final click. For a long moment, I stare down at the small piece of plastic resting against my shoe. My rational mind catalogs possible explanations. Static electricity, minute floor imperfections creating an optical illusion, stress-induced hallucination brought on by too many 18-hour days and not enough sleep. But the security camera mounted in the corner of the hallway has undoubtedly recorded my sudden stillness, my inexplicable hesitation over retrieving a simple keycap. Later, reviewing the footage on my phone, I watch myself step into the hallway and simply stop. The camera's angle doesn't capture the floor where the keycap fell, only my rigid posture and the way my hands clench and unclench at my sides. To any observer, I appear to be staring at nothing, frozen by some invisible terror, but I know what I saw. I retrieve the keycap and snap it back into place, fingers trembling slightly as I align the tiny plastic tabs with their corresponding slots. The K key functions normally, producing its expected tactile feedback and crisp click. Everything returns to normal, except it doesn't. Over the following days, I find myself cataloging every small object in the studio, with obsessive precision. Paper clips arranged in perfect rows along the desk's edge. USB drives lined up with military precision. Even the sugar packets beside the coffee maker seem to maintain their position with supernatural determination. The first test happens accidentally. A guitar pick slips from my fingers while I'm adjusting mic placement, falling toward the space between two equipment racks. It should tumble into the dark gap, lost among dust bunnies and forgotten cables, until the next deep cleaning. Instead, it ricochets off something unseen and skids across the floor, coming to rest against my left boot with the soft whisper of plastic on vinyl. I don't move for 5 full minutes, staring down at the thin piece of tortoiseshell plastic. When I finally bend to retrieve it, my knees crack loudly in the silence, and I swear I feel something watching me, not through the security cameras, but from somewhere deeper, more intimate. The sensation of being observed by the building itself. The pattern establishes itself over the next week. A pencil rolls off the console during a particularly energetic mixing session, travels 3 feet across the floor, and stops perfectly aligned with my right foot. A memory card drops from my palm while transferring files and somehow navigates around chair legs and cable bundles to find the exact spot where my shoe meets the floor. Each incident follows the same impossible physics. Objects that should scatter randomly or disappear into the studio's numerous hiding places instead migrate to my feet with unerring precision, always stopping exactly where my toes meet the floor, never sliding past or falling short. As if something measures the distance with mechanical accuracy, I begin dropping things intentionally. Small tests performed in the deepest hours of night when the building's breathing grows most pronounced. A pen, released from chest height, falls straight down and rolls in a gentle arc to rest against my sneaker. Coins, individually and in groups, find their way to my feet regardless of how I scatter them. Even a crumpled piece of paper, aerodynamically chaotic, somehow navigates air currents to land precisely where my shoe meets the floor. The security footage becomes my obsession. Hours of reviewing recordings, searching for evidence of what I know is happening, but the cameras capture only my increasingly erratic behavior. Sudden stops in the middle of mundane tasks, long periods of staring at the floor, the way I've begun walking through the studio with exaggerated care, as if the vinyl might shift beneath my feet. Sleep becomes elusive. I find myself lying in bed at dawn, muscles rigid with tension, replaying each incident with forensic detail. The sound of the objects moving, never quite silent, but too quiet for the microphones to capture. The way they seem to accelerate slightly just before making contact with my shoes, as if eager to complete their journey. The growing certainty that whatever governs their movement is learning, adapting, becoming more efficient with each iteration. 3 weeks after the keycap incident, I realize I haven't knelt or crouched in the studio for days. Every dropped object finds its way to my feet, eliminating any need to bend down. My back aches from the constant upright posture, but something deep in my gut rebels against the idea of lowering myself to floor level. The few times I've attempted it, reaching for a cable or adjusting a floor monitor, panic rises in my throat, and I abort the movement before my knees can touch the vinyl. It's as if something doesn't want me on my knees. The thought arrives unbidden during another sleepless pre-dawn hour, and once it takes root, it grows with malignant persistence. Objects migrate to my feet to prevent me from kneeling. But why? What happens if I force the issue? What am I being protected from, or prevented from discovering? The studio's lease expires in 2 months. I should be looking for a new space, packing equipment, preparing for the inevitable transition to some cheaper location further from the city center. Instead, I find myself studying the vinyl flooring with new intensity, searching for patterns in its industrial texture. The way light reflects off its surface reveals subtle variations, areas where the pattern repeats, minute imperfections in the manufacturing process, and something else. Something that might be intentional. Viewed from the right angle, usually when I'm standing near the hallway entrance, the floor's pattern creates an optical effect. Lines and shapes emerge from the random industrial texture, forming what could be interpreted as symbols or letters. Not obvious enough to notice during casual observation, but persistent enough to haunt peripheral vision during long night sessions. I photograph the floor from various angles, adjusting exposure and contrast until the patterns become more visible. What emerges makes my breath catch, a rough approximation of text, spelled out in the vinyl's manufactured chaos. Words that seem to shift and change depending on viewing angle and lighting, but always maintaining the same essential message. Do not kneel. The images could be coincidence, pareidolia, the human tendency to find patterns in randomness, the same psychological quirk that reveals faces in clouds and voices in white noise. But the objects that migrate to my feet suggest otherwise. They form a barrier, preventing me from assuming the position that would bring my eyes closer to the floor's surface, where the hidden message waits to be read. I spend the next several nights documenting the phenomenon with methodical precision, dropping objects of various weights and compositions, measuring their final positions, calculating angles and velocities. The data reveals an uncomfortable truth. Whatever force governs their movement is becoming more sophisticated. Earlier incidents showed simple attraction to my feet, but recent drops demonstrate complex trajectory planning. Objects now navigate around obstacles, changing direction multiple times to reach their destination. More disturbing is their increasing accuracy. The latest tests show objects stopping within millimeters of the exact same spot, not just near my foot, but at a specific point where my sneaker's rubber sole meets the floor, as if something is learning the precise dimensions of my footwear and adjusting its calculations accordingly. The building's breathing grows more pronounced as winter deepens. Expansion and contraction cycles that should be predictable become erratic, producing sounds at unexpected intervals. Sometimes I catch myself holding my breath, waiting for the next creak or pop, wondering if the timing correlates with the object's movements, if the building itself is somehow coordinating their migration. Sleep deprivation plays tricks with perception. In the small hours before dawn, when exhaustion blurs the line between waking and dreaming, I sometimes glimpse movement in my peripheral vision. Not the objects themselves, but shadows that seem to guide their paths across the floor. Dark shapes that vanish when I turn to look directly, leaving only the familiar arrangement of inanimate things and my growing certainty that I'm being deliberately isolated from the floor's surface. The realization that I haven't touched the studio floor with anything except my shoes in over a month arrives with the force of revelation. No kneeling, no crouching, no sitting cross-legged while organizing cables. Every interaction mediated through the rubber soles of my sneakers, maintaining a barrier between my skin and the vinyl surface. What would happen if I removed my shoes? The question haunts my increasingly fractured sleep, growing more insistent as the days shorten and the studio's nocturnal breathing deepens. Would the objects still migrate to my feet, or would they seek some new target? Would the floor's hidden message become clearer, more urgent? I can't bring myself to find out. Instead, I invest in thicker socks, adding layers between my feet and the sneakers that have become my only point of contact with the floor. The additional insulation feels like armor against some unnamed threat, protection from whatever waits beneath the vinyl's printed surface. But protection from what? And why now, after 18 months of uneventful occupancy, has the studio developed this strange solicitude for my posture? What changed to transform a simple workspace into something that actively prevents me from kneeling? The questions multiply without answers, breeding in the silence between the building's breaths. Each dropped object that finds its way to my feet feels like a small victory for whatever intelligence governs their movement. Another successful intervention. Another moment when I remain upright instead of lowering myself to the floor's level. I've begun referring to it as the alignment in my private thoughts. The way objects orient themselves to my position, the precision of their final placement, the growing sophistication of their trajectories. As if something is learning to align the physical world with its intentions, using my dropped possessions as vectors for some incomprehensible influence. The studio's lease expires in 6 weeks. I should leave, find some new space where objects fall according to normal physics, and floors display only their intended patterns. But departure would mean abandoning the mystery, losing whatever protection the alignment provides against the alternative, whatever fate awaits those who ignore its warnings and lower themselves to the vinyl's surface. So, I remain upright, surrounded by objects that refuse to stray far from my feet, wondering if I'm the victim of some elaborate psychological manipulation or the unwitting beneficiary of an intelligence that understands dangers I cannot perceive. The building breathes around me, patient and watchful, while shadows gather in the spaces between dropped objects and the floor's hidden text waits for eyes that will never come close enough to read its full message. Some things I'm learning are better observed from a distance, even if that distance is measured in the thickness of rubber soles and the growing certainty that I no longer occupy this space alone. Story 9. The pizza grease had long since congealed on paper plates scattered across our makeshift conference table when Quinn pulled out that ridiculous board game from her desk drawer. The Austin heat still pressed against the agency's windows even at 9 p.m., and we were all looking for any excuse to avoid the stack of client revisions waiting on our screens. It wasn't even a real Ouija board, just something she'd fashioned from poster board during a particularly slow Friday, complete with crooked letters she'd drawn in Sharpie, and a plastic shot glass for a planchette, the kind of thing that gets passed around creative agencies like urban legends, gathering significance through repetition rather than any inherent power. But Blake insisted we try it. Blake, with her laugh that carried 3 floors down, and her habit of collecting stray office supplies like they were wounded birds. She positioned herself across from me, fingers barely touching the improvised pointer, eyes bright with the kind of mischief that made clients either love her campaigns or fire us entirely. I should mention that I didn't ask about myself, not once. While Quinn giggled about meeting tall strangers, and Blake demanded to know if she'd ever make creative director, I kept my questions strictly professional. Deadlines, client approval, whether the Henderson campaign would ever see daylight. Boring questions from someone who'd learned early that the universe had a cruel sense of humor about personal revelations. That's why Blake's question caught me off guard. She'd been pressing about timelines, asking about our upcoming pitches, when suddenly her expression shifted. The laughter drained from her face as she stared at the board with an intensity that made the rest of us lean forward. The plastic shot glass began moving, whether from her unconscious pressure or something else, I'll never know, tracing letters with deliberate slowness. GIRL space TWO space STRIPES space BEFORE space AUTUMN. Girl. 2 stripes. Before autumn. The silence that followed felt thick enough to taste. Quinn broke it with nervous laughter, suggesting we call it a night, but Blake just stared at those scrawled letters like they'd burned themselves into her retinas. When I asked what she'd been thinking about, she shook her head and claimed she hadn't been concentrating on anything specific. We packed up the game. We went home. Life moved forward with the relentless momentum that makes extraordinary moments feel like shared hallucinations within a week. 15 months later, Blake called me from a medical laboratory waiting room. Her voice came through the phone different somehow, thinner, like it was traveling a greater distance than the 7 blocks between her apartment and mine. Autumn had arrived early that year, and through my office window, I could see the first yellow leaves spiraling down from the oak trees lining Congress Avenue. She told me about the test, about the 2 pink stripes that had appeared in the small plastic window that morning, about how she'd been sitting in that sterile waiting room for 40 minutes, watching other women flip through magazines, when the memory of that ridiculous pizza night game had surfaced unbidden. Girl, 2 stripes. Before autumn. I tried to laugh it off. Coincidences happen. The human brain is designed to find patterns, even where none exist. Blake herself had been the first to dismiss the board game as nonsense, claiming she'd probably moved the planchette unconsciously. But there was something in her voice, a tremor that suggested she wasn't entirely convinced by her own rationalizations. That conversation should have been the end of it, a strange coincidence to file away under funny how memory works. Instead, it became the beginning of something that would make me question the reliability of my own perceptions. The first sign came 3 days later. I was reviewing the Henderson campaign materials when I noticed something odd about the font choices. Each headline seemed to emphasize certain letters, G's and I's and R's, that stood slightly bolder than their neighbors. When I mentioned it to Quinn, she looked at me like I'd suggested the text was written in ancient Aramaic. The fonts looked perfectly normal to her, she insisted, though I could see her squinting at the screen with newfound uncertainty. Then I started hearing Blake's laugh in empty corridors. Not her actual laugh, I would have recognized that immediately, but something that shared its particular rhythm and cadence. It would echo from conference rooms I knew were unoccupied, always just distant enough that I could convince myself it was the building's ventilation system or traffic noise filtering through inadequate windows. The autumn progressed with unseasonable consistency. Every morning brought another layer of fallen leaves, as if the trees were shedding their coverage in measured intervals. I began paying attention to patterns I'd never noticed before. The way certain clients always called on days when the barometric pressure was dropping, how Blake's absence from the office seemed to coincide with particular phases of the moon. Blake, meanwhile, had taken extended leave. When I asked Quinn about it, she mentioned that Blake was handling some personal matters, and left it at that. But I noticed Quinn's reluctance to maintain eye contact during these conversations, and the way she'd changed subjects immediately afterward, as if Blake's name had become something unlucky to linger on. I found myself staying late at the office more frequently, partly to avoid the growing sense of unease that seemed to follow me home, and partly because something about the building felt different after hours. The familiar creaks and settling sounds had acquired new meanings, like a language I was slowly beginning to understand. One evening in late October, while organizing files in the archives, I discovered something that made my hands shake badly enough that I had to sit down. Buried in a folder of old campaign materials was a mock-up Blake had created 18 months earlier, months before our pizza night game. It was a pregnancy test advertisement that never went to client, just a creative exercise she'd apparently worked on during downtime. The tagline read, 2 lines, "Your future starts here." The accompanying image showed a woman's silhouette against an autumn landscape, leaves falling like confetti around her figure. In the corner, barely visible unless you knew to look for it, was a small logo featuring 2 parallel stripes. I stared at that file until the words began to blur. Blake had designed an advertisement about pregnancy tests, featuring 2 stripes in autumn imagery, then months later received a prediction from a homemade Ouija board about a girl, 2 stripes, and autumn. The coincidence felt too perfect, too orchestrated to be random. But that raised more questions than it answered. Had Blake unconsciously remembered her own design when moving the planchette? Had she somehow influenced the board's message based on submerged memories of her creative work? Or was something else entirely orchestrating these connections? I made copies of the file and took them home, though I couldn't articulate why. My apartment felt smaller that night, as if the walls were pressing inward with each hour that passed. I spread the papers across my kitchen table and studied them under different lights, looking for details I might have missed. The woman in the silhouette looked familiar, though I couldn't place why. Her posture suggested someone listening to something distant, head tilted at an angle that reminded me of Blake during our game night. The more I stared, the more convinced I became that this wasn't a stock photo or generic illustration. This was someone Blake knew, someone she'd used as a model. Sleep became difficult, not impossible, but contaminated by dreams that felt more like memories of events that hadn't happened yet. I would find myself standing in landscapes I'd never visited, watching autumn leaves fall upward into gray skies while voices spoke in languages that sounded almost like English, but arranged in unfamiliar patterns. During these dreams, I was always searching for someone. Not Blake specifically, but someone whose absence felt like a missing tooth, present in its very absence, impossible to ignore once noticed. The search would take me through endless corridors that resembled our office building, but stretched far beyond its actual dimensions, past conference rooms filled with people playing games I didn't recognize with rules I couldn't understand. I started calling in sick more often, partly because I was genuinely unwell. Whatever was happening was taking a physical toll, and partly because the office felt increasingly hostile. Colleagues would stop talking when I approached, not in any obvious way, but with the subtle timing that suggested they'd been discussing something they didn't want me to hear. Quinn seemed particularly affected. She'd watch me with an expression I couldn't decode, as if I'd become something she recognized but couldn't quite categorize. When I asked about Blake, she would give me updates that felt scripted. Blake was doing well. Blake was handling her situation. Blake sent her regards. But I never received any direct communication from Blake herself, despite multiple attempts to reach her. Her phone went straight to voicemail, a generic message that sounded like her voice but lacked the warmth I associated with her personality. Her social media accounts had gone silent. Her apartment building's doorman claimed not to have seen her in weeks. It was as if Blake was becoming progressively less real, fading from the world in increments so small that only someone paying careful attention would notice. November arrived with unseasonable warmth, as if the seasons themselves had become unreliable. I found myself spending entire evenings walking through the neighborhoods around our office, looking for signs that reality was operating according to familiar rules. But everything felt slightly off-kilter, like a photograph that's been cropped just wrong enough to create subtle discomfort without obvious cause. The leaves weren't falling properly. Instead of the random patterns I expected, they seemed to arrange themselves into configurations that resembled letters, not clearly enough to photograph or show to anyone else, but obvious enough that I couldn't ignore them. G's and I's and R's scattered across sidewalks in formations that lasted just long enough for me to recognize them before the wind redistributed the evidence. I began carrying a notebook, documenting these observations with the methodical thoroughness of someone building a case. Dates, times, locations, weather conditions, all the variables that might explain what I was experiencing. The notebook filled quickly with entries that looked increasingly frantic, handwriting that degraded from careful print to hurried scrawl as the observations accumulated. Reading back through these notes, I couldn't decide whether they represented evidence of something extraordinary or documentation of a gradual psychological breakdown. The line between perception and projection had become so blurred that I could no longer trust my own interpretations of events. That's when I decided to return to the office after hours and retrieve that homemade Ouija board from Quinn's desk drawer. The building felt different at night, not threatening exactly, but expectant, like a theater waiting for the curtain to rise. Security let me in without question. I'd worked late often enough that my presence after hours didn't seem unusual, but the elevator ride to our floor lasted longer than it should have, as if the building had grown additional floors while I wasn't paying attention. Our workspace looked smaller under the emergency lighting, shadows pooling in corners that seemed deeper than they had during the day. Quinn's desk was exactly as she'd left it, down to the coffee mug with lipstick stains and the stack of layouts waiting for approval. The board game was still in her bottom drawer, wrapped in the same manila envelope we'd used to store it 15 months earlier. The poster board felt heavier than I remembered, and the Sharpie letters seemed darker, as if they'd been traced over multiple times since our original game night. I set it up on the conference table where we'd played before, positioning chairs in the same approximate locations we'd occupied. The plastic shot glass felt cold against my fingertips, though the building's heating system was working perfectly. I wasn't planning to ask questions. I just wanted to see if touching the board would trigger any memories that might explain the growing sense of unreality that had been plaguing me. But as soon as my fingers made contact with the improvised planchette, it began moving with purposeful determination. WO space, STRIPES space WA, S space NEVER space THE space PREDICTION. The shot glass paused, then continued with mechanical precision. IT space WAS space THE space INVITATION. My hands weren't moving the planchette. At least, I didn't think they were. The motion felt external, as if something was guiding my fingers rather than the other way around. But that could have been unconscious muscle movement, the power of suggestion, any number of psychological explanations that would make more sense than supernatural intervention. The board continued spelling out messages I didn't want to understand. Messages about coincidences that weren't coincidences, about patterns that existed whether or not anyone was there to observe them, about Blake, who had apparently known something was coming long before our pizza night game, who had maybe even orchestrated the entire sequence of events through methods I couldn't comprehend. According to the board, Blake was fine. Better than fine, actually. She had found something she'd been looking for without realizing she was searching for it. But she couldn't come back to explain, because coming back would break the connection she'd established with whatever force had been speaking through our improvised game. The messages grew increasingly specific, referencing conversations Blake and I had never had, shared experiences that existed only in my memory but felt completely real. They described a version of events where Blake had planned everything, the late-night game, the mysterious prediction, even her subsequent disappearance, as part of some larger purpose I wasn't equipped to understand. By the time I finally lifted my fingers from the planchette, dawn was beginning to seep through the office windows. The conference room looked exactly as it had when I'd arrived, but I felt fundamentally changed, as if I'd aged several years over the course of a single night. I packed away the board game and returned it to Quinn's drawer, then sat at my desk and tried to process what had happened. Either I'd just experienced genuine supernatural communication, or I'd spent 7 hours having an elaborate conversation with my own subconscious mind. Both possibilities were equally disturbing. When Quinn arrived that morning, she found me still sitting at my desk, staring at nothing in particular. She asked if I was feeling all right, and I told her I'd been there since early morning working on campaign revisions. She accepted this explanation without question, though I noticed her glancing toward her desk drawer with an expression I couldn't interpret. Blake never returned to the office. According to Quinn, she'd moved to another city to start fresh, though she couldn't provide any specific details about where or when. The agency hired a replacement who was competent but lacked Blake's particular energy, and within a few months, it felt like Blake had been erased from our collective memory. But I still hear that laugh sometimes, echoing through empty corridors when I stay late. And every autumn, when the leaves begin to fall, I find myself looking for patterns in their arrangement, wondering if messages are still being transmitted through methods too subtle for conscious recognition. I kept that notebook, filled with observations that may or may not represent evidence of something extraordinary. Sometimes I read through it, trying to decide whether the person who wrote those entries was documenting real phenomena or chronicling a gradual disconnection from reality. The answer feels less important now than it did then. What matters is that somewhere out there, Blake is fine. Whether that's true in any objective sense, or simply a story I've constructed to make sense of her disappearance, hardly seems relevant anymore. Some invitations once accepted change everything about how you understand the world, even if you're never quite sure whether you actually received one. Story 10. The first time it happened, I was 3 beers deep into forgetting why my wife had packed her things that morning. The Coors Light wasn't helping much, just made the empty house feel bigger, made the silence press against my eardrums like cotton stuffed too tight. That's when the sound came. Low. So low it wasn't really a sound at first, more like a feeling in my chest cavity. A turbine spinning down, maybe, or the ghost of some massive engine winding to a stop just beyond the edge of hearing. It passed over my backyard in Brookside like a shadow made of noise, and I swear every window in the house shivered in its frame. The pressure hit next. Not the kind you feel before a storm. This was different. Sudden. Clinical. Like someone had flicked a switch and stolen half the air from my lungs. My ears popped twice, sharp little explosions that left them ringing. Then, puff. Dry and final, like an airbag deploying in an empty parking garage. The kind of sound that makes you hold your breath without knowing why. I was off the couch and out the back door before my brain caught up with my body. The night air hit me thick and humid, typical for October in Oklahoma, but wrong somehow. Too still. The usual cricket symphony had cut out mid-note, leaving only the distant hum of air conditioners and the occasional semi-grinding gears on Highway 64. Nothing. No plane banking low toward Tulsa International. No helicopter circling with searchlights. No emergency vehicles racing down Peoria Avenue with their sirens wailing. Just my backyard, looking exactly like it had 3 minutes ago when I'd glanced out while opening beer number 3. But the barometric pressure gauge on my desk, a digital monstrosity my ex had bought me for Christmas 2 years back, thinking I'd develop some interest in weather patterns, showed a reading that made my stomach drop. 29.4 inches of mercury. 20 minutes earlier, it had been steady at 30.1. Air pressure doesn't just plummet like that. Not without a reason. I stood there in my boxers and yesterday's t-shirt, bare feet getting damp from the evening dew, and tried to make sense of what I'd experienced. The sound had been so low frequency, it felt more than heard, vibrating through the foundation of the house, through the bones in my chest, like standing too close to a massive subwoofer, but emptier somehow. Hollow. Mrs. Chen next door was watering her mums under the porch light, same as every night. If a jet had buzzed the neighborhood, she'd have noticed. She notices everything. Keeps a mental catalog of which mail carrier shows up when, which teenagers walk home from school at what time, which dogs bark and why. But when I called over the chain link fence, she just looked puzzled. "Sound?" she said, adjusting her grip on the garden hose. I didn't hear anything unusual. The Hendersons' place behind mine stayed dark and quiet. No porch lights flickering on. No concerned voices drifting through their kitchen window. Whatever had passed over my yard, if anything actually had, it seemed I was the only witness. That should have been the end of it. Planes fly low sometimes. Wind patterns shift. Digital gauges malfunction. Stress does funny things to perception. And God knows I'd been under enough of it lately with the divorce papers scattered across my kitchen table like accusations. But 3 nights later, it happened again. Same time. Same impossible sound. That turbine winding down from somewhere just above the roofline. Felt more than heard. Same pressure drop. Sharp enough to make my sinuses ache. Same dry puff that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. This time I was ready. I'd left the back door unlocked and my phone charged, ready to record whatever might unfold. But when I rushed outside, thumb already swiping to the camera app, the world greeted me with the same aggressive normalcy as before. Empty air. Crickets resuming their nightly chorus like actors picking up their cues after a brief intermission. The pressure gauge read 29.3. I checked the National Weather Service data online. No storms in the area. No pressure systems moving through. According to every meteorological source I could find, the atmospheric pressure in Tulsa had remained steady all evening. But my gauge doesn't lie. The timestamps match perfectly with the sound, with that feeling of something massive settling just beyond the reach of my vision. By the 4th incident, I'd developed a theory. Construction equipment, maybe. Some kind of industrial machinery operating on a schedule that coincided with my evening routine. Except the nearest construction site was 6 blocks away, and the sound wasn't directional. It seemed to come from directly overhead, maybe 50 feet up, exactly the altitude where something large and mechanical would need to hover to avoid power lines and tree branches. I started paying attention to everything. Air traffic patterns, my neighbors' schedules, the precise time the streetlights flickered on, the sounds of cars changing gears at the stop sign on Brookside Boulevard, the rhythm of sprinkler systems clicking to life across the neighborhood. Pattern recognition became an obsession. I mapped every occurrence in a notebook I'd found in the kitchen junk drawer, the kind my ex had used for grocery lists and weekend plans that would never happen now. 11 incidents over 3 weeks, always between 11:05 and 11:15 p.m., always followed by that pressure drop, always leaving me alone in my backyard, staring up at empty air while my neighbors went about their evening routines, as if nothing had disturbed the fabric of their ordinary Wednesday nights. The sound began changing. Subtle shifts at first, the turbine note holding a few seconds longer, the POF echoing slightly, like sound bouncing off a curved surface. Sometimes I caught what might have been a secondary noise underneath, a rhythmic thrum that reminded me of helicopter rotors, but wrong somehow. Too fast or too slow, I couldn't tell which. I started staying awake past 11, waiting. The anticipation became its own kind of torture, coiling in my stomach as the clock hands crept toward the danger zone. Some nights nothing happened, and I'd feel simultaneously relieved and disappointed, like I'd been stood up by something I wasn't sure I wanted to meet anyway. But when it came, and it always came eventually, the familiarity somehow made it worse. I knew the sequence now. The building subsonic pressure, the way the air itself seemed to thicken, the moment when every dog in the neighborhood would stop barking at once, as if responding to some signal I couldn't perceive. The pressure drops were getting more severe. 29.2, 29.1. Numbers that should coincide with approaching tornadoes or hurricane-strength storms, not clear October nights in suburban Oklahoma. I started wondering if I was losing my mind. The thought crept in gradually, the way morning fog settles over a lake. Maybe the divorce proceedings had pushed me over some invisible edge. Maybe grief manifests differently than I'd expected. Not as tears or anger, but as auditory hallucinations and phantom pressure changes. Maybe the digital gauge was broken and I'd been tracking the malfunction patterns of cheap Chinese electronics rather than actual atmospheric phenomena. But the notebook didn't lie. 11 events documented with timestamps and pressure readings, each entry written in the same careful handwriting, each incident followed by the same fruitless search of an empty backyard. If I was hallucinating, I was doing it with impressive consistency. I called in sick to work and spent the day researching. Military aircraft operating out of Tinker Air Force Base, experimental drone programs, sound frequencies that might cause pressure variations, subsonic warfare research, mass hallucination events, temporal lobe epilepsy, tinnitus complications, environmental poisoning from industrial chemicals. Every search led me deeper into rabbit holes that offered explanations but no comfort. The internet is full of people who've heard impossible things, seen aircraft that shouldn't exist, recorded footage that somehow never quite captures what they thought they'd witnessed. Forums dedicated to mysterious booms. Websites cataloging unexplained pressure anomalies. Videos of empty skies that posters swear contained something visible just moments before hitting record. I wasn't the first person to experience something like this. That realization should have been reassuring, but instead, it felt like joining a club I'd never applied for membership in. The 12th incident happened on a Thursday. Same time window, same impossible sound. But this time the POF was followed by something new. A series of smaller sounds, like footsteps on a roof that wasn't there. Measured, deliberate. The sound of something heavy finding its footing on a surface I couldn't see. My pressure gauge registered 28.9 inches of mercury. That's approaching severe weather levels. That's the kind of reading that precedes tornadoes and derechos, not peaceful suburban evenings in northeast Tulsa. I stood in my backyard until after midnight, staring up at stars that seemed too bright, too close, wondering what kind of craft could land on invisible ground 50 feet above my hedge roses. The air itself felt different afterward, not just the pressure, but the quality of it. Thicker somehow, more substantial, like breathing through silk. Mrs. Chen was still awake, her kitchen window glowing warm and yellow. When I waved, she waved back with the automatic friendliness of neighbors who don't really know each other but share a fence line. No concern in her expression, no indication that anything out of the ordinary had happened in her corner of the universe. The footstep sounds came again, 3 nights later. More of them this time, and lasting longer. A whole routine of movement overhead, arrival, settling, purposeful motion across what might have been a deck or platform that existed in some frequency of reality I couldn't access. The pressure gauge bottomed out at 28.6, numbers that should have triggered weather service alerts across 3 counties. I started leaving my back door unlocked during the day, just in case. In case of what, I couldn't say. But the possibility that something might need to get inside had begun to feel less like paranoia and more like preparation. Work became impossible to focus on. I'd catch myself checking weather apps obsessively, looking for pressure system maps that might explain what was happening to my gauge. My boss started asking questions about my sudden interest in meteorology, about the notebook I kept open on my desk, about why I seemed to flinch every time a plane passed overhead. The phone calls started during the 5th week. Dead air at first, then what might have been breathing, but wrong somehow. Too slow or too fast, I couldn't decide which. Sometimes there were background sounds, mechanical humming, that same subsonic turbine note I'd learned to dread. The calls always came during business hours, never when I was home waiting for evening visitations. I stopped answering unknown numbers. Then I stopped answering the phone altogether. The divorce lawyer left increasingly urgent voicemails about papers that needed signing, court dates that couldn't be postponed. But her voice seemed to be reaching me from another planet where legal documents and custody arrangements mattered. The sound was changing again. Still that low turbine wind down, still the pressure drop, still the poff of something large settling onto nothing. But now there were harmonics underneath, frequencies that made my teeth ache and my vision blur slightly around the edges. Sometimes I caught myself swaying on my feet during the incidents, like my inner ear was receiving signals it didn't know how to process. Pattern recognition had evolved into pattern obsession. I knew exactly which nights it would happen now, could feel them approaching like a storm front, some subtle shift in the electromagnetic field that preceded the actual event by hours. My skin would start feeling tight around midday. The air would taste slightly metallic by evening. Even my dreams would change, becoming more vivid and directional, as if something were tuning the frequency of my unconscious mind. The notebook had grown into 3 notebooks. Times, dates, pressure readings, duration of events, weather conditions, moon phases, air traffic data, my neighbors' schedules, correlation attempts with everything from solar flare activity to seismic readings from the Oklahoma Geological Survey. Every variable I could think of, mapped and cross-referenced in handwriting that had grown increasingly erratic as the weeks passed. But no conclusions. No breakthrough moment where the pattern revealed its secret. Just data points accumulating toward some revelation that remained stubbornly beyond reach. The footstep sounds had become routine, arriving, settling, moving with purpose across their invisible platform, then departing with the same measured deliberation, sometimes lasting 15 minutes, sometimes shorter, never quite long enough for me to adapt to their presence, never brief enough to dismiss as imagination. My pressure gauge started registering readings that should have been impossible under clear skies. 28.4, 28.2. Numbers associated with the eyes of major hurricanes, not suburban backyards in Oklahoma where the most dramatic weather events were usually thunderstorms that knocked out power for a few hours. I started researching alternate explanations, parallel dimensions, temporal displacement, military experiments with atmospheric manipulation, extraterrestrial visitation patterns, quantum physics applications. I didn't understand, but that seemed to suggest reality might be more flexible than I'd assumed. Every theory sounded equally plausible and equally insane. The calls were coming more frequently now. Still no voices, but the background sounds were getting clearer. That mechanical humming, yes, but also something else. Environmental audio that didn't quite match any earthly location I could identify. Wind that moved wrong. Water that sounded too thick. Structural sounds from architecture built according to principles that wouldn't make sense to human engineers. I disconnected my landline, changed my cell number. The calls found the new number within hours. Mrs. Chen asked if I was feeling all right, mentioned that I'd been spending a lot of time in the backyard lately, often in the middle of the night. Wondered if there was anything she could help with. Her concern felt genuine, but somehow distant, like kindness extended across a gap that was wider than our shared fence line. I told her I'd been having trouble sleeping since the divorce. Not entirely a lie, though not exactly the truth either. She nodded with the understanding of someone who'd lived through her own share of life changes, offered to bring over some herbal tea that might help, then went back to tending her garden while I stood there feeling like I was watching her through the wrong end of a telescope. The 17th incident lasted almost half an hour. Arrival, settling, extended movement overhead, then something new, sounds that might have been communication. Not voices exactly, but structured audio that suggested meaning. Patterns within patterns, like hearing half of a phone conversation conducted in a language that hadn't evolved on Earth. My pressure gauge hit 28.1 and stayed there for the entire duration. Numbers that should have triggered emergency broadcasting systems, evacuations, storm chasers racing in from 3 states. But the Weather Service data showed normal atmospheric conditions. Every official source insisted that the air pressure in Tulsa had remained stable all evening. I was either experiencing something that defied meteorological physics, or I was documenting the most elaborate hallucination in psychiatric history. Both possibilities felt equally terrifying. The footstep sounds had developed into full routines now. Multiple presences, coordinated movement, what seemed like purposeful work being conducted just beyond the range of normal perception. Sometimes I heard what might have been tools or equipment, Mechanical sounds that suggested construction or maintenance or installation of something I couldn't see, but could somehow feel taking shape in the air above my backyard. Sleep became impossible during the week leading up to the 18th incident. Not from anticipation, but from a growing sense that something was monitoring my house, my schedule, my responses to each event. I'd catch myself checking the locks obsessively, though I couldn't explain what I thought might be trying to get in. Or out. The phone calls had evolved into something that might almost be considered conversation, if conversation could happen between species that didn't share common definitions of communication. Background sounds that responded to my breathing patterns. Mechanical rhythms that seemed to acknowledge my presence on the other end of the line. No words, no language I could recognize, but an increasing sense that something was trying to establish contact through the limited interface of analog telecommunications. I started talking back. Not words exactly, just sounds, breathing patterns, tapping rhythms on the phone receiver. The background audio would shift in response, adjusting its patterns to mirror or complement whatever I offered. We were developing a primitive protocol, though for what kind of exchange I had no idea. The 18th incident changed everything. Same time window, same impossible sound building toward arrival, same pressure drop that made my ears pop and my sinuses ache. But this time, when the POF came and the footstep sounds began, I heard something else underneath, my own voice, distorted and delayed, speaking words I hadn't said yet, speaking words I wouldn't say until after I heard myself saying them. The pressure gauge registered 27.8 inches of mercury, numbers associated with the most severe weather phenomena on record, numbers that should have preceded atmospheric catastrophe. But the air remained still. The night remained clear. The stars remained exactly where they should be in an October sky over northeast Oklahoma. And somewhere 50 feet above my backyard, something had learned to echo my voice across time. Story 11. The glass still haunts me. Not the Ouija board itself. That particle board monstrosity with its faded letters and theatrical font, but the wine glass we'd stolen from the kitchen cabinet. Crystal, probably. The kind that rings when you tap it. Clear enough to see your fingerprints smudged against the curve. I should have known better than to agree when they suggested it. 3 college friends crammed into a studio apartment in San Diego's Hillcrest neighborhood, the marine layer creeping through windows we couldn't afford to close despite the October heat. The air conditioning had been broken for weeks, and our landlord treated repair requests like suggestions. We'd been drinking cheap beer and complaining about midterms when someone, I can't remember who, dragged out that board from a closet that smelled of mothballs and marijuana residue. The apartment felt smaller with all of us gathered around the coffee table, our knees bumping as we arranged ourselves in a circle. The board looked ridiculous under the fluorescent kitchen light someone had dragged over, casting harsh shadows that made our faces appear hollow. I remember thinking how stupid we looked, 4 grown men hunched over what amounted to a parlor game. But I volunteered to be the conductor anyway. The glass felt cold against my fingertip, colder than it should have been in that stifling apartment. I pressed my index finger to its base, feeling the smooth indentation where the manufacturer's mark was etched. The others placed their fingers around the circumference, and I could feel their pulse through the glass. Quick, nervous rhythms that seemed to synchronize after a few seconds. Nothing happened at first. We asked the usual questions. Is anyone there? What's your name? The glass remained motionless, reflecting the harsh light and fractured patterns across the board. My friends exchanged glances, half disappointed, half relieved. One suggested we give up, try again later with more people. That's when I decided to prove it was all nonsense. I tilted my head back, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a bird in flight, and spoke to empty air. If there's anyone there, talk to me without me looking. I won't watch the letters. The change was instantaneous. My arm locked. Not gradually. Not the way a muscle cramps or stiffens from holding an awkward position. One moment I had control. The next my forearm felt like it had been cast in cement. The sensation traveled up to my shoulder, and I felt my entire upper body resist my will as the glass began to move. It carved across the board with purpose, dragging our fingers along. I heard the scraping sound it made against the cardboard surface, a high whisper that seemed to echo in my ears. My friend's breathing changed, shorter, more rapid. Someone whispered, "Holy shit," under their breath, but the words sounded distant, muffled. When the movement stopped, I looked down. Pair. 4 letters, traced in a clean line across the board. Stop. I tried to laugh, tried to break the tension that had settled over us like a physical weight, but the sound caught in my throat. That's when I noticed my finger. The skin around the nail had gone completely white, drained of blood as if something had been cutting off circulation. But more disturbing was the ring around my wrist, a perfect circle of condensation from the glass, cold against my skin like a bracelet made of ice water. The mark was too precise, too intentional. Condensation doesn't work that way. We packed up the board without discussion. My friends left soon after, their good nights hurried and awkward. I spent the rest of the evening flexing my fingers, trying to convince myself the whole thing had been an elaborate prank, some sort of group hypnosis or mass hysteria. But the mark on my wrist took 3 days to fade. The real problem started 2 weeks later. I was in Professor Chen's advanced statistics class, struggling through a particularly brutal problem set, when the guy next to me suggested we work through the rest together. "Come on," he said, packing up his notebook. "Let's continue this in the library, where we can spread out." My arm seized. Not completely. Not like that night with the glass, but enough to make me drop my pencil. The sensation lasted only seconds, but it left me shaking. I made excuses, gathered my things, and left class early, my right arm feeling heavy and unresponsive. I told myself it was stress. Midterms, lack of sleep, too much caffeine. College was notorious for breaking people down, making them see patterns where none existed. I'd read about students who developed all sorts of psychological tics during exam periods, but it happened again the following week. My study group was reviewing organic chemistry when one of the members looked at her watch and suggested we continue the session the next day. This time, my entire right side locked up for nearly 10 seconds. I sat frozen in my chair, watching my friends' faces shift from concern to confusion as they asked if I was okay. I started avoiding the phrase. When people suggested continuing something, a conversation, a project, a meal, I'd quickly change the subject or excuse myself. I became hyper-aware of language, listening for those 2 specific words in every interaction. Conversations began to feel like minefields. The arm episodes became more frequent, more severe. During a job interview at a local bookstore, the manager mentioned how they'd continue the hiring process after checking references. My arm shot out involuntarily, knocking over a display of bookmarks. I mumbled an apology and left without waiting for their response. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie in bed replaying that night, trying to remember details that seemed to shift each time I examined them. Had my friends really not been pushing the glass? Had I imagined the resistance in my arm? The more I analyzed the memory, the more it seemed to dissolve and reshape itself. I started researching Ouija boards, diving deep into forums and academic papers about ideomotor responses and group psychology. The scientific explanations were comforting. Unconscious muscle movements, the power of suggestion, the tendency for groups to collectively create meaning from random events. I bookmarked articles about mass hysteria and conversion disorders, building a rational framework to contain what had happened. But rationality couldn't explain the physical symptoms. My right arm began to feel different even when I wasn't experiencing episodes. The muscle tone seemed altered, as if the limb belonged to someone else. I'd catch myself flexing my fingers obsessively, testing for responsiveness. Sometimes I'd wake up to find my arm completely numb, positioned in ways I couldn't remember arranging. The mark on my wrist never fully disappeared. It would fade to almost nothing, then darken again without warning, a pale circle that felt cooler than the surrounding skin. I began wearing long sleeves regardless of the weather, unable to explain the mark to others without sounding insane. 3 months after the incident, I returned to that apartment. My friends had moved out, but I convinced the new tenant to let me inside. The coffee table was gone, replaced with a futon and a gaming setup. The fluorescent light had been swapped for track lighting that cast softer shadows. But standing in that space, I could feel something residual. The air felt thicker, charged with a tension that made my teeth ache. My right arm began to tingle before I'd even fully entered the room. I knelt where we'd placed the board, running my fingers across the carpet. The fibers felt different in one specific spot, stiffer, as if something had been spilled and never properly cleaned. When I pressed my face close to the floor, I caught a scent that didn't belong. Ozone, like the air before a thunderstorm. That night, I dreamed of the glass. In the dream, I was alone in the apartment, but the board was still there on the coffee table. The glass sat in the center, perfectly still. As I approached, I could see my reflection multiplied in its surface. Dozens of faces staring back, each wearing a different expression. Some looked terrified. Others appeared hungry. I reached for the glass without meaning to, my arm moving independently of my will. The moment my finger touched the base, every reflection began to mouth the same word in perfect synchronization. Continue. I woke up screaming, my right arm completely numb from shoulder to fingertip. The episodes intensified after that. Any variation of the trigger phrase would set off the response. Keep going. Move forward. Don't stop. My body began to feel like a battleground between competing impulses. Part of me wanted to seek help, to find a doctor who could explain what was happening. But another part, growing stronger each day, whispered that seeking help would mean having to continue the conversation about that night. And conversations, I'd learned, were dangerous territory. I started carrying a small notebook, documenting each incident. Time, location, specific trigger words, duration of the episode. The data revealed no clear pattern beyond the obvious linguistic connection. The randomness was somehow more disturbing than any pattern would have been. At least patterns could be predicted, avoided, controlled. By December, I'd developed elaborate strategies for navigating daily life. I'd memorize alternative phrasings for common situations, rehearse responses that would redirect conversations away from dangerous territory. I became a student of linguistics, mapping the subtle ways people expressed continuity and persistence. But the hypervigilance was exhausting. I began to lose weight, my sleep fragmenting into brief, anxious periods, punctuated by dreams of moving glass and multiplied reflections. My academic performance suffered as I spent more energy avoiding triggers than focusing on coursework. The worst part was the growing certainty that I was being watched. It started as a peripheral sensation, the kind of awareness you develop when someone stares at you from across a crowded room. But this felt more intimate, more invasive. The presence seemed to emanate from my right side, just beyond the edge of vision. When I turned to look, there was never anything there, just empty space that somehow felt occupied. I began to suspect that the presence was connected to my arm, that whatever had communicated through the glass that night had never really left. The idea should have terrified me, but instead it brought an odd sort of relief. If something external was controlling these episodes, then I wasn't losing my mind. I was simply inhabited. The thought led me down darker research paths. I read about possession, about entities that attach themselves to people through divination practices. The accounts I found online were filled with religious terminology and dramatic exorcism stories that felt removed from my experience. What I was dealing with seemed more subtle, more patient, more intelligent. I started talking to it, quietly, when I was alone in my dorm room. I'd address the empty space beside my right shoulder, asking questions that went unanswered. I told it about my day, about the increasing difficulty of avoiding triggering situations. Sometimes I'd sense a shift in the air, a change in temperature or pressure that felt like acknowledgement. The one-sided conversations became a strange comfort. For the first time since that October night, I didn't feel completely alone with what was happening. Something was listening, even if it couldn't or wouldn't respond. Spring semester brought new challenges. Group projects became nearly impossible to navigate, as collaborative work inevitably involved discussions about continuing tasks and meeting deadlines. I developed a reputation for being difficult, unreliable, Professors began to express concern about my increasingly erratic behavior. That's when I met Dr. Rodriguez. She was a visiting lecturer in the psychology department, specializing in dissociative disorders and trauma responses. During a chance encounter at the campus coffee shop, she noticed the way I reacted when the barista mentioned they'd continue serving the seasonal menu through April. My right arm had locked up mid-reach for my drink, and I'd spent several seconds frozen with my hand extended toward the counter. Dr. Rodriguez didn't approach me directly. Instead, she left her business card tucked under my cup with a brief note. Sometimes the mind protects us in ways that feel like imprisonment. If you'd like to explore what's happening, I'm here to listen. I carried the card for weeks before calling. Her office was different from what I'd expected. Warm lighting, comfortable furniture, plants that looked actually healthy rather than decoratively neglected. She listened to my account without interruption, taking minimal notes, her expression remaining neutral throughout. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked a question that caught me off guard. "Do you believe something spoke through you that night?" I'd expected skepticism, clinical detachment, attempts to rationalize my experience into manageable psychological categories. Instead, she seemed genuinely curious about my interpretation of events. "I don't know," I admitted. "Some days I think it was just group hysteria. Other days..." I flexed my right hand, feeling the familiar stiffness in the joints. "Other days I think something answered when we called." "And how does that possibility make you feel?" The question hung in the air between us. I realized that no one had asked me about my feelings regarding the experience, only about the symptoms, the episodes, the practical impact on my daily functioning. "Terrified," I said finally, "but also less alone." Dr. Rodriguez nodded as if this made perfect sense. Trauma can create strange relationships with our own bodies, our own sense of agency. Sometimes we develop symptoms that feel external because the alternative, accepting that we've lost control, is too overwhelming to process. She was offering me a way out, a clinical framework that could contain what I'd experienced. But even as she spoke, I felt a familiar tingling in my right arm, a subtle resistance that seemed to object to her interpretation. "What if it's not trauma?" I asked. "What if something actually happened that night? Then we'd need to figure out how to coexist with that reality," she said simply. "The goal isn't necessarily to eliminate your symptoms, but to find ways to live with them that don't restrict your life so severely." I started seeing Dr. Rodriguez twice a week. We worked on developing coping strategies for managing the episodes, techniques for grounding myself when I felt the familiar loss of control. Slowly, I began to reclaim some agency over my daily experience. But the presence remained. If anything, it seemed to grow stronger as I grew more stable. Our one-sided conversations became more frequent, more intimate. I began to sense responses, not words exactly, but shifts in the atmosphere that felt like communication. Sometimes I'd ask a question and immediately know the answer, as if the knowledge had been placed directly in my mind. Through this strange dialogue, I learned that the presence wasn't malevolent, exactly. It was more like a refugee, something that had been seeking connection when we'd provided an opening that October night. It had meant to say wait rather than stop, but the language barrier had created confusion. It had been trying to establish a more gradual, consensual form of contact. Instead, it had triggered my body's protective mechanisms, creating the episodes that had dominated my life for months. The revelation should have been reassuring, but it raised new questions. If this entity was genuinely trying to communicate, what did it want? Why had it chosen me specifically? And most disturbing, what would happen if I stopped resisting and allowed the connection to fully establish itself? I began to experiment cautiously, deliberately exposing myself to trigger phrases while in controlled environments. Instead of fighting the episodes, I tried to relax into them, to see what would happen if I didn't resist the loss of control. The results were remarkable. During one episode, triggered by a classmate's casual suggestion that we continue working on our final project, I felt my arm move with deliberate purpose across the surface of my desk. When I looked down, I found that my fingers had traced out a complex mathematical equation, one that solved a problem I'd been struggling with for weeks. The handwriting wasn't mine. More experiments followed. I'd sit at my desk with a pen in my right hand and allow myself to enter the dissociative state I'd learned to associate with the episodes. My arm would move independently, producing drawings, equations, even short written passages that demonstrated knowledge I didn't possess. The entity, I realized, was highly intelligent. More than that, it seemed to understand concepts that were beyond my academic level. Through our bizarre collaborative sessions, my grades began to improve dramatically. Professors who had been concerned about my erratic behavior started praising my sudden insights and original thinking. But the cost was becoming apparent. Each session left me drained, mentally and physically. I'd emerge from the episodes with gaps in my memory, hours that seemed to compress into minutes or expand into subjective days. My sense of personal identity began to feel negotiable, as if the boundaries between my consciousness and the presence were gradually dissolving. Dr. Rodriguez noticed the changes immediately. "You're different," she observed during one of our sessions. "More confident, but also more distant, as if you're not entirely present in your own life." I tried to explain what I'd discovered, the collaborative relationship I'd developed with the entity, but the words sounded insane even to me, and I could see the concern growing in her expression. "Integration fantasies are common in dissociative disorders," she said carefully. "The mind creates elaborate narratives to explain and justify unusual experiences. What you're describing could be a very sophisticated form of self-protection." "But the knowledge," I insisted. "I'm producing work that's beyond my capabilities, solving problems I shouldn't be able to solve. Or perhaps the episodes are allowing you to access parts of your own intelligence that trauma had previously blocked. Sometimes healing looks like sudden access to abilities we always possessed but couldn't reach." Her clinical interpretation felt inadequate, reductive, but it also offered a safety net, a way to understand my experience that didn't require accepting the existence of something impossible. That night, I sat in my dorm room with a blank sheet of paper, deliberately triggering an episode by repeating variations of the phrase that had started it all. "Let's continue. Keep going. Don't stop." My arms seized, then began to move with fluid precision across the page, but instead of equations or diagrams, it produced words. "You doubt. This creates interference. Full integration requires trust." I stared at the message, written in handwriting that resembled mine, but felt foreign. The entity was responding to my conversation with Dr. Rodriguez, to thoughts I hadn't even fully articulated to myself. "Who are you?" I wrote with my left hand. My right hand responded immediately. "A traveler. Displaced. Your invitation created sanctuary. What do you want from me?" "Partnership. Your reality is vast, complex. I wish to understand through direct experience. And if I refuse?" The pen paused for a long moment. Then, "Separation is possible but destructive for both. You have seen the cost of resistance. I have experienced isolation. Neither serves our interests." I spent the rest of the night in dialogue with myself, or with something that was using my body to communicate. The conversation was unlike anything I'd experienced, simultaneously intimate and alien. The entity spoke of concepts I could barely grasp: dimensional displacement, consciousness as a form of energy that could persist across realities, the possibility of multiple beings sharing a single physical form. By morning, I had filled 17 pages with our back-and-forth exchange. Reading through it later, I couldn't determine which thoughts were originally mine and which belonged to the presence. The boundary had dissolved so completely that the distinction felt meaningless. That was 3 months ago. Now I sit in my apartment, a different one, larger, closer to campus, writing this account while my right hand moves independently across a second notepad, working through a graduate-level physics problem that I was never assigned. The entity has become a constant companion, sometimes dormant for hours, sometimes so active that I feel like a passenger in my own body. My academic performance has reached levels that attract attention from faculty across multiple departments. I've been offered research opportunities, graduate fellowships, invitations to present at undergraduate conferences. The success should feel rewarding, but it's increasingly difficult to take credit for achievements that don't feel entirely my own. Dr. Rodriguez and I ended our sessions by mutual agreement. She felt I had developed sufficient coping mechanisms for managing my symptoms. I knew that continued therapy would require explaining changes that had no clinical framework for understanding. Sometimes late at night, I wonder what would happen if I told her the truth, that I'm not managing symptoms so much as learning to coexist with an intelligence that may not be entirely human, that my body has become a shared space, my consciousness a collaborative effort. But those conversations would inevitably involve discussions about continuing treatment, pursuing further evaluation, possibly even hospitalization for observation. And the word continue still triggers the same physical response it always has, though now I understand it differently. It's not resistance anymore. It's recognition. Something in me, something that may not entirely be me, responds to that word because it represents the fundamental nature of our relationship. We are continuing something that began that October night in San Diego, something that neither of us fully understood at the time. The glass, I realize now, was never the important part. It was just a tool, a focal point for establishing contact. The real connection happened in the moment I offered my body as a conduit, when I pressed my finger to the base of that wine glass and invited something unknown to speak through me. And it said, stop not as a command, but as a warning. Stop and consider what you're beginning. Stop and understand the implications. Stop and choose consciously whether you want to proceed. I didn't stop. I didn't understand. And now, months later, I'm not certain I could choose differently, even if I wanted to. My right arm moves across the physics notepad, solving equations that explore the mathematical possibilities of consciousness transference, dimensional overlap, the theoretical frameworks that might explain entities existing between realities. The work is elegant, sophisticated, far beyond anything I could produce alone. Outside my window, spring is transitioning to summer. The academic year is ending, and I'll soon need to decide about graduate school, about career paths, about the kind of future I want to build. But every decision feels collaborative now, subject to input from a perspective that isn't entirely my own. I close my laptop and set aside the notepad, flexing both hands experimentally. The left responds normally, predictably. The right moves with a subtle hesitation, as if checking with something else before obeying. Tomorrow I'll wake up and continue with my life. Classes, meals, conversations with friends who don't know that I'm no longer entirely the person they remember. I'll navigate social situations and academic challenges, making choices that feel increasingly like negotiations between multiple parties sharing the same physical space. And sometimes, when someone suggests we continue what we're doing, I'll feel that familiar seizure in my right arm, and remember that October night when I invited something impossible into my life. But I won't know, I can never know for certain, whether I'm a student who's developed an elaborate psychological coping mechanism, or a man who's learned to share his body with something that exists beyond the boundaries of normal reality. The uncertainty has become the only constant, the one thing I can depend on in a life that no longer feels entirely my own. And perhaps that's exactly what the presence intended when it traced those 4 letters across a Ouija board in a cramped San Diego apartment. Pere. Stop and consider. Stop and choose. Stop and accept that some invitations, once extended, can never be fully withdrawn. The physics notepad beside me shows a new line of text, written in handwriting that might be mine. Ready to continue? I pick up the pen with my left hand and write my response. Do I have a choice? My right hand moves without my volition. You always had a choice. You simply made it before you understood what you were choosing. I set down the pen and lean back in my chair, watching the late afternoon sunlight stream through my window. Somewhere in the distance I can hear students laughing as they head to dinner, their voices carrying the easy confidence of people whose bodies belong entirely to themselves. But I'm no longer certain that singular ownership was ever the natural state of things. Maybe consciousness is more fluid than we assume, more willing to accommodate unexpected partnerships. Maybe some of us are just better at hearing when something knocks on the door we didn't know we'd left open. I gather my notebooks and prepare for another evening of collaborative study, another night of shared dreams, another day of living a life that feels increasingly like an experiment in coexistence. And I try not to think too carefully about what might happen if this partnership ever decides it wants to become something more permanent. because some questions are too dangerous to ask directly. Some answers might require more than I'm ready to give. And some forms of continuation, once begun, reshape everything that comes after in ways that can never be undone. Story 12. The quarter breathes differently at 3 in the morning. Standing outside that cramped antique shop on Royal Street, I should have noticed how the humid air seemed to gather around the storefront like it was feeding on something inside. But I was distracted by the peculiar display in the window. A collection of dolls, some porcelain, some wood, and one that looked like it had been sewn from shadow itself. The proprietor emerged from the depths of his shop like smoke taking human form. His fingers, yellowed from decades of cigarettes, traced the air as he spoke about provenance and history. But I wasn't listening. My attention had locked onto that cloth figure in the window. It stood barely 8 inches tall, its fabric body a deep charcoal that seemed to absorb the weak streetlight filtering through the glass. No features marked its head, just careful stitching that suggested where a face might be, could be, should be. "That one's been here since before I took over the shop," he said, noticing my fixation. "Previous owner left a note saying it came from somewhere upriver, but you know how these stories go." He shrugged, the gesture carrying decades of skepticism about the tales that followed old objects through the quarter. The price was reasonable, almost suspiciously so for something clearly handmade with such meticulous care. The stitching was perfect, tiny, even loops that caught the light in ways that made the fabric seem to shift when I wasn't looking directly at it. I paid in cash and wrapped it myself in the brown paper he offered, though I noticed he seemed reluctant to touch it directly. The drive back to Raleigh took 14 hours, and I spent most of it glancing in the rearview mirror at the paper-wrapped bundle on the back seat. Twice I could have sworn I saw the paper moving slightly, as if something inside was breathing, but highway wind through a cracked window plays tricks on peripheral vision. My home office occupies the converted attic space, reached by narrow stairs that creak in a specific sequence I've memorized over the years. I placed the doll on a shelf between a collection of vintage fountain pens and a small cactus that somehow thrives despite the room's limited natural light. It looked perfectly innocent there, just another curiosity among the accumulated debris of a life spent collecting interesting things. The first week passed without incident. I worked late most nights, the soft glow of my monitor the only light source after sunset, and gradually became aware of the doll's presence in my peripheral vision. Not watching exactly, it had no eyes to watch with, but occupying space with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to its size. Thursday night, I was reviewing quarterly reports when I heard it. The sound emerged from the walls themselves, a whisper that might have been wind through old wood, except the night was still. At first, I dismissed it as the house settling, those familiar groans and sighs that old buildings make as temperature drops. But this was different, rhythmic, almost conversational, like someone speaking in a language composed entirely of consonants and held breath. I turned off my desk lamp and sat in the darkness, listening. The whispers continued for perhaps 30 seconds before fading into the general hum of electronics and distant traffic. When I switched the light back on, the doll seemed unchanged, but I noticed that one of the stitches along what would have been its temple had caught the light differently, creating the brief illusion of an eye socket. Sleep came fitfully that night. I kept waking to the sensation that someone was in the room with me, standing just beyond the reach of consciousness. Each time I opened my eyes, the familiar shadows of furniture and books met my gaze, unchanged and innocent in the pale moonlight filtering through gauze curtains. The weekend brought a thunderstorm that rattled the windows and sent rain hammering against the roof with unusual violence. I was reading in the living room when the power failed, plunging the house into darkness broken only by sporadic lightning flashes. Candles cast dancing shadows on the walls as I climbed the stairs to collect my laptop charger from the office. The doll was gone. I searched the shelf 3 times, moving each item carefully, but the space where it had stood was empty, except for a faint outline in the dust. The rational part of my mind offered explanations. It could have fallen, rolled under furniture, been knocked off by the storm's vibrations. I spent 20 minutes on hands and knees, flashlight beam probing every corner and crevice, but found nothing. When the power returned an hour later, the doll was back on its shelf, exactly where I had left it. This became the new normal. Objects would be displaced when I wasn't looking directly at them, always returning to their proper positions when I investigated. The whispers came more frequently now, usually when I was alone in the office after dark. They carried an urgency that bypassed language entirely, communicating something important that my conscious mind couldn't quite grasp. I began sleeping poorly, waking each morning with a taste of dust in my mouth and the peculiar sensation that someone had been breathing very close to my face during the night. The space around the doll seemed to generate its own gravity, drawing my attention even when I was trying to focus on work. More than once, I caught myself staring at it for minutes at a time, studying those precise stitches, as if they might reveal some hidden message. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night in late September. I had been working on a particularly complex project, the kind that requires total concentration, when I became aware of a presence behind me. Not the vague sense of being watched that had become commonplace, but the unmistakable feeling of someone standing directly behind my chair. I turned around. Nothing was there, of course, but the air felt displaced, as if something had just moved out of the way. The doll sat on its shelf as always, but now one of the stitches along its neck had come loose, creating a small gap in the fabric. Through that gap, I glimpsed something that made my vision blur and my chest tighten with inexplicable panic. Darkness. Not the ordinary absence of light, but a darkness so complete it seemed to have substance, texture, weight. It pressed against the opening in the fabric like water against a dam, held back only by the integrity of the remaining stitches. I left the office immediately and didn't return for 3 days. When I finally worked up the courage to go back, the loose stitch had been repaired. The stitching was identical to the original work. The same tiny, perfect loops, the same careful spacing. But I knew I hadn't fixed it, and no one else had access to the house. That night I dreamed of standing in a vast space filled with whispers in languages I didn't recognize. Faces that weren't quite faces surrounded me, features suggested by shadow and negative space rather than any actual physical structure. They pressed close, their non-breath warm against my skin, trying to tell me something urgent about the nature of space itself, how it could be occupied, molded, given intention and desire. I woke with the absolute certainty that something had been lying next to me in the bed, something that left no indentation in the mattress, but whose presence I could feel in the warm spot where my own body heat had been absorbed and redirected. The decision to get rid of the doll came suddenly, born from a desperation that surprised me with its intensity. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. That felt somehow dangerous, like breaking a container that was meant to hold something. So I drove to an antique shop in the older part of downtown. The proprietor was a soft-spoken man with gentle eyes, who didn't ask questions about provenance or history. He accepted the doll with the same professional courtesy he might show to any consignment piece, promising to find it an appropriate place among his inventory. I walked out feeling like I had shed an invisible weight, breathing freely for the first time in weeks. 3 months passed. I had almost convinced myself that the entire experience had been stress-related, a combination of too much coffee, too little sleep, and the power of suggestion working on a mind already primed for supernatural interpretation by the atmospheric purchase location in New Orleans. But curiosity is a persistent thing. I found myself driving past the antique shop more frequently than necessary, and eventually worked up the courage to stop in and browse, ostensibly looking for a gift for my sister's birthday. The shop was warm and welcoming, filled with the pleasant scent of old wood and brass polish. I made casual conversation with the owner about various items before finally working up the nerve to ask about the cloth doll I had brought in. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a brief shadow crossing his features before the professional smile returned. "Oh, that piece," he said, and I noticed his hands were busy rearranging items on the counter as he spoke, as if they needed something to do. "Well, it's been interesting. Nothing wrong exactly, just..." He paused, seeming to search for the right words. Customers mentioned feeling a sort of breeze when they walk through that section. Not unpleasant, they say, just unusual for an interior space with no windows nearby. He looked at me more carefully then, as if trying to read something in my expression. Few folks have asked about purchasing it, but they always change their minds. Can't really say why. Just get to the counter and decide they'd rather look at something else instead. I thanked him and left without buying anything for my sister. That night I lay awake thinking about the space between stitches, about how absence can have presence, how emptiness can press against fabric like something eager to get out. Or in. I thought about faces that aren't faces, about the way negative space can suggest features more powerfully than any positive representation, about the difference between a void and a presence that chooses not to manifest in ways we typically recognize. Most of all, I thought about the proprietor's words, customers feeling a breeze in an interior space with no windows nearby. A breeze that suggests breath, suggests proximity, suggests something occupying the space around an object in ways that have nothing to do with the object itself. The whispers haven't returned to my house, but sometimes, late at night when I'm working in the office, I find myself looking at the empty spot on the shelf where the doll used to sit. Not looking for it, I know it's not there. Looking at the space itself, the way it seems to hold a different quality of emptiness than the space around it. Sometimes I think I can still hear whispers coming from that empty space, speaking in a language made of held breath and possibility. They seem to be trying to tell me something important about the nature of presence and absence, about how the most powerful occupancy might be the kind that leaves no physical trace. But perhaps that's just the sound of my own breathing, amplified by paranoia and the particular acoustics of guilt. After all, what makes a face isn't the fabric that suggests its boundaries. It's the space that fabric decides to contain. And some spaces, once given shape and intention, learn to maintain themselves long after their original containers have been removed. They learn to breathe through emptiness, to whisper through silence, to press their non-features against the faces of sleeping strangers in houses hundreds of miles away. The antique shop is still there on the old side of downtown. I drive past it sometimes, usually at night, and I've noticed that the interior lights never seem to reach the back corner where textile pieces are displayed. There's always a pocket of deeper shadow there, a space that seems to absorb, rather than reflect the illumination around it. Customers still mention the breeze, according to mutual acquaintances who've shopped there. They describe it as feeling like someone walking very close behind them, close enough to share breath. But when they turn around, there's nothing there but empty air and the faint scent of old fabric. I've never gone back inside. Some curiosities are better left undisturbed, and some spaces, once they've learned to hold something invisible, prefer to keep their secrets close. The whispers may have stopped in my house, but I suspect they've simply found a more appropriate location. A place where customers expect to encounter things that carry stories, where the boundary between past and present is already thin enough to allow for certain impossibilities. The face was never in the fabric. It was always in the space the fabric learned to embrace. And spaces, once they understand their purpose, rarely forget how to breathe. Story 13. The house in Scranton promised solitude, and it delivered, just not the kind I'd expected. I'd found the rental through a classified ad that felt almost apologetic in its brevity. Single-story home, quiet neighborhood, writer-friendly, month to month, cash only. The landlord, a rail-thin man who introduced himself simply as Garrett, met me at the property with keys that looked older than the house itself. He handed them over without ceremony, mentioned something about the previous tenant leaving suddenly, and drove away in a pickup truck that rattled like loose bones. The house sat at the end of Maple Street, where the asphalt gave way to gravel, and the street lights stopped bothering to reach. Single story, as advertised, with cream-colored siding that had yellowed around the edges and a front porch that sagged just enough to make you question its commitment to staying attached. Inside, the rooms felt spacious in that hollow way that comes with minimal furniture and maximum emptiness. I'd come here to finish my novel, a psychological thriller that had been sitting at chapter 12 for the better part of 6 months. The city had been too much. Sirens, neighbors, the constant hum of life happening around me. I needed silence, the kind that let thoughts settle like sediment in still water. For the first 3 nights, I got exactly that. Then came the 4th night, and with it, the sound of someone climbing stairs that didn't exist. I woke to the creak of old wood-bearing weight, that particular groan that comes from years of feet finding the same spots on the same steps. My bedside clock read 3:30 a.m. in those red digits that seemed to glow brighter in the dark. The sound came from the hallway just outside my bedroom door, a steady rhythm of footsteps ascending, each one deliberate and measured. But this was a single-story house. I lay there, listening, as someone or something climbed step after step in a vertical journey that should have been impossible. The creaking was perfect, too perfect, like a Foley artist's masterwork. I counted 15 steps before they stopped, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt like pressure against my eardrums. In the morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream. The mind, after all, can construct remarkably detailed audio experiences during sleep. I'd read about it somewhere, probably in one of those psychology articles writers consume when procrastinating on their actual work. But when I walked to the kitchen for coffee, I found the chairs. All 4 of them had been moved from their places around the small dining table and arranged in a perfect line down the center of the kitchen floor. They faced the far wall, where a faint rectangular outline in the paint suggested a picture frame had once hung. The chairs sat like an audience waiting for a performance, aligned with mathematical precision. I stood there, coffee mug halfway to my lips, staring at this impossible arrangement. I lived alone. I was certain I'd gone to bed with those chairs around the table, the way they'd been every night since my arrival. Yet here they were, transformed into a gallery for ghosts. My first instinct was to put them back, to restore the normal order of things. But something made me pause. Call it a writer's instinct for the strange, or perhaps the first whisper of obsession. Instead, I grabbed my camera and photographed everything. The chairs, their spacing, the angle of their arrangement, the empty wall they faced. Then I found a roll of masking tape and marked their positions on the linoleum floor, small X's that would let me measure any future displacement. I should have left Scranton that morning. Instead, I made coffee, sat at my laptop, and tried to write. The words came slowly, filtered through a distraction I couldn't name. Every few minutes, I'd glance toward the kitchen, half expecting to see the chairs had moved again. They hadn't, of course. They remained in their audience formation, patient as monuments. That evening, I called the landlord. Garrett's voice carried the flat affect of someone uninterested in surprises. "Previous tenant mention anything unusual?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Depends what you mean by unusual. Sounds at night. Movement of furniture." A pause. "Look, the house has been empty for 3 months. You're the first renter since then. Previous guy, he had some ideas about the place. Ideas that didn't align with reality, if you follow me." "What kind of ideas?" "The kind that make a man leave in the middle of the night without taking his security deposit." Garrett hung up before I could ask more questions. The second night of sounds came at 3:30 a.m. exactly. This time I was ready, lying awake with my phone's voice recorder app prepared. The footsteps began their impossible ascent, and I captured every creak, every groan of phantom wood. 15 steps just as before, ending in that profound silence. I played the recording back immediately. It was perfect. Too perfect. The audio quality was crisp, each footstep distinct and resonant. If this was some kind of hallucination, my phone was apparently having the same delusion. In the morning, the chairs had been rearranged again. This time, they'd been moved closer to the wall, as if someone had decided the audience needed a better view of whatever performance was supposed to take place there. I photographed the new positions and measured the displacement, exactly 18 inches forward from their previous spots. This pattern continued for a week. Every night at 3:30 a.m., the phantom staircase. Every morning, the chairs moved incrementally closer to the empty wall. I documented everything with the methodical obsession of a scientist studying an impossible phenomenon. Photos, measurements, audio recordings, detailed notes about temperature changes, air pressure, even the behavior of the house's pipes and electrical systems. The rational part of my mind, the part that had been trained in skepticism by years of research and fact-checking, began constructing explanations. Carbon monoxide could cause auditory hallucinations, though the house's heating system was electric. Infrasound from nearby construction or traffic might create the illusion of footsteps, though Maple Street was removed from any major development. Sleep deprivation could explain the strange perceptions, though I was sleeping better here than I had in months. But what about the chairs? What about the physical evidence? I began setting up tests. I placed coins on the chair seats to see if they'd fall during any movement. They never did. The chairs moved as if carried, not pushed or dragged. I tried staying awake in the kitchen, watching them directly. On those nights, nothing happened, though I'd still hear the footsteps from whatever room I occupied. It was as if the house was camera-shy, unwilling to perform its strange theater when observed directly. 2 weeks in, I made a discovery that changed everything. I'd been exploring the basement, really just a crawl space with delusions of grandeur. When I found them, dozens of photographs scattered in a corner behind the water heater. They showed the kitchen, taken from various angles over what appeared to be many months. In every photo, the chairs were arranged differently, but always in some kind of audience formation facing that empty wall. The photographs weren't mine. The quality suggested they'd been taken with an older digital camera, something from several years back. Some showed the kitchen during different seasons. Summer light slanting through windows in some images, winter's gray pallor in others. A few had timestamps in the corner, dates spanning nearly 2 years, ending abruptly 3 months ago. My predecessor, it seemed, had been documenting the same phenomenon. I spread the photographs across my laptop keyboard and studied them like evidence in a criminal case. The pattern was clear. The chairs moved in a slow progression toward the wall, reaching their closest point during what appeared to be midwinter, then beginning a gradual retreat. The cycle seemed to repeat annually, like some strange seasonal migration. But what disturbed me most was the realization that in some of the later photographs, a figure appeared to be sitting in one of the chairs. The image quality wasn't good enough to make out details. Just a dark silhouette, human in shape, facing the empty wall with the same patient attention as the empty chairs around it. The figure appeared in maybe a dozen photos, always in a different chair, never quite in focus. I enlarged these images on my laptop screen, squinting at pixels that refused to resolve into clarity. Was it a trick of light and shadow, a photographic artifact? Or had the previous tenant been documenting something, someone I hadn't yet encountered? That night I didn't wait for 3:30 a.m. I positioned myself in the kitchen at 3:25, sitting in the chair closest to where the mysterious figure had appeared in the photographs. If something was going to manifest, I wanted to be part of the audience rather than a distant observer. The house held its breath around me. Even the usual settling sounds, the tick of cooling pipes, the whisper of air through vents, seemed muted. The kitchen felt larger in the darkness, as if the walls had pulled back to accommodate whatever was coming. At exactly 3:30 I heard the first step, but this time was different. The sound didn't come from the hallway. It came from directly above me, as if someone was ascending stairs that occupied the same space I was sitting in. I could feel the vibrations through the chair, through the floor, through my bones. The footsteps passed through me, around me, existing in some dimensional space I couldn't access but couldn't deny. As the phantom climber reached what would have been the top of their impossible staircase, I felt a presence settle into the chair beside me. Not weight. The chair didn't move, didn't creak under any burden, but I could sense occupation, the way you might feel someone's attention even with your eyes closed. We sat together, this invisible presence and I, both facing the empty wall where something had once hung. The silence stretched between us, comfortable in its strangeness. I found myself wondering what we were waiting for, what performance was meant to unfold against that blank space. Then, slowly, I began to see it. It started as the faintest suggestion of color against the white paint, a sepia wash, like an old photograph developing in chemicals. The image emerged with agonizing gradualism. First an outline, then details, then full clarity. It was a family portrait. A man, woman, and elderly gentleman posed formally against a painted backdrop. The woman's hand rested on the seated man's shoulder. The older gentleman stood slightly apart, his expression serious but kind. All three wore clothing from perhaps 30 or 40 years ago, their faces carrying that particular stiffness people adopted for formal photography in an earlier era. But as I watched, the photograph began to move. Not dramatically. These weren't movie special effects. The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible. A slight shift of the woman's eyes, the barely detectable rise and fall of breathing, the minute adjustment of the older man's posture, as if he'd grown tired of standing so still. I understood then what the chairs were for. We were the audience for this quiet performance, this daily resurrection of a family portrait that remembered motion. The house wasn't haunted in the traditional sense. It was remembering, replaying the echo of lives that had once filled these rooms. The performance lasted perhaps 10 minutes. The figures in the portrait moved with dreamlike slowness, occasionally glancing toward our audience of chairs as if acknowledging our presence. The woman smiled once, a brief expression of warmth that transformed her formal pose into something achingly human. The older gentleman nodded, a gesture of recognition or greeting that bridged the gap between his time and mine. Then, as gradually as it had appeared, the image faded back into the blank wall, leaving only the rectangular outline where the frame had once hung. The presence beside me stirred, not physically, but in whatever dimensional space it occupied. I felt acknowledgement, perhaps even gratitude, as if my witnessing had somehow validated the performance. Then it was gone, leaving me alone with the four chairs and the returning silence. I sat there until dawn, staring at the empty wall, trying to process what I'd experienced. Hallucination seemed too simple an explanation, yet accepting the alternative meant abandoning a lifetime's worth of rational thought. The photographs on the floor around me suggested I wasn't the first to grapple with this paradox. Days passed in a blur of research and documentation. I scoured local records, obituaries, property histories, anything that might explain the portrait I'd seen. I found references to the Hutchinson family, Gerald, his wife Dorothy, and his father-in-law, William Morrison. They'd lived in this house from 1987 to 2019, when all three had passed within months of each other. Natural causes, according to the records. The quiet conclusion of lives lived fully in this single-story house on Maple Street. The portrait, I learned from an estate sale listing, had been donated to charity after the family's passing. Someone, perhaps Garrett, perhaps the previous tenant, had removed it from the wall, leaving only the outline and the obligation to remember. Every night now I joined the audience. The invisible presence would settle beside me, and together we'd watch the Hutchinson family perform their gentle resurrection. Sometimes the performance varied, different poses, different interactions, different moments from what might have been decades of family photographs. But always, it was quiet, dignified, and profoundly human. I stopped trying to rationalize what I was experiencing. Some mysteries, I realized, weren't meant to be solved, but simply witnessed. The house had found its purpose as a theater for memory, and I had found my role as both audience and archivist. My novel remained unfinished, forgotten in favor of a different kind of story. Each morning I'd photograph the chairs in their new positions, document the subtle changes in their arrangement, and add to the collection the previous tenant had started. I was the curator now of something that existed in the space between memory and presence, between the rational and the impossible. 3 months into my residency, I received a call from my editor in New York. She wanted to know about my progress, when she might expect the completed manuscript. I found myself unable to explain why I couldn't leave, why the story I'd come to tell had been replaced by one I could only witness. "The house needs me," I finally said, which sounded insane even to my own ears. But it was true. The performances had grown more vivid, more detailed, as if my presence as an audience member was somehow feeding whatever force maintained them. The invisible companion who joined me each night felt more solid, more present. The chairs moved with greater precision, arranging themselves with increasing care for optimal viewing angles. I wasn't just watching anymore. I was participating in something larger, something that transcended the simple division between living and dead, between memory and reality. Last week I found a new photograph mixed in with the others the previous tenant had left behind. It showed the kitchen as I'd been arranging it, with my laptop on the table, my coffee cup beside it, my jacket hung over the back of a chair. But in the image, 5 chairs faced the wall instead of 4. In the 5th chair, the one I occupied each night during the performances, sat a dark silhouette that might have been me. I stared at that photograph for hours, trying to understand what it meant. Was I becoming part of the house's memory? Would the next tenant find pictures of me sitting in patient attention, waiting for performances that existed in some dimension beyond normal perception? The possibility should have terrified me. Instead, I felt a strange peace. Tonight, I'll take my place in the audience once again. The presence beside me will manifest with its growing solidity, and together we'll watch the Hutchinson family live again for 10 precious minutes. The chairs will move a little closer to the wall, drawn by forces I no longer attempt to understand. And tomorrow morning, I'll photograph everything, adding one more image to the collection that documents impossibility with the patient persistence of faith. Because some stories I've learned can only be told by living them. Whether what I'm experiencing is supernatural visitation or the elaborate architecture of a mind unwilling to accept ordinary loneliness, I no longer care to determine. The distinction has become irrelevant. What matters is the watching, the witnessing, the preservation of something precious that exists in the narrow space between what we know and what we hope. The house continues its quiet rehearsal, and I remain its devoted audience, waiting for a performance that may never end, documenting mystery with the methodical obsession of someone who has found, finally, a story worth telling with his life, rather than his words. Story 14. The board had been a joke, nothing more. $23 at the thrift shop on Hillsborough Street, its corners worn smooth by decades of fingers tracing letters, asking questions that probably never needed answering. When Davidson announced he was transferring to the Seattle office, someone suggested we give him a proper Raleigh send-off. The bourbon had been flowing for hours in his cramped apartment when I pulled the thing from my bag, grinning at the collective eye rolls from the group. Really? Davidson had laughed, but his eyes held that peculiar gleam people get when they're half drunk and willing to believe in anything that might make the evening memorable. The others gathered around his coffee table, their skepticism dissolving into curiosity as we dimmed the lights. I should have noticed how easily the planchette moved under our fingers, how it seemed to know exactly where it wanted to go before we'd even formed our questions. But the alcohol had dulled my instincts, and when Davidson asked about his future in the Pacific Northwest, we all leaned forward eagerly as the wooden piece began its dance across the alphabet. The first few responses were generic, the kind of vague predictions you'd expect from a party game. Success in new ventures, travel, romance. Then Johnson, who'd been growing increasingly animated with each prediction, decided to ask about me. "What about him?" he'd said, nodding in my direction. "What's waiting for our friend here?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as our fingers rested lightly on the planchette. It began moving immediately, with a purposefulness that made my stomach tighten. ANACQUAINTANCE. We paused, waiting for more, but the piece remained still until someone prompted it to continue. WILLPUSHYOU. "Push you what?" Davidson had whispered, and I felt the hair on my arms stand on end as the planchette resumed its journey. FROMBEHIND. The silence in the room grew thick as we waited for the final piece of the message. When it came, I felt my blood turn to ice water. INTOCURRENTBEFORE 35. Someone had made a joke about staying away from rivers, and the nervous laughter that followed broke the spell. We'd packed the board away and spent the rest of the evening drinking away the uncomfortable feeling it had left behind. By morning, hungover and rational, I'd convinced myself it was nothing more than the collective unconscious movement of 6 intoxicated hands seeking entertainment. But that was 6 months ago, and since then, those words have infiltrated my life with surgical precision. It started small, conversations where colleagues would mention being behind on projects or discuss the current state of the market. I'd catch myself listening more intently when someone used the word acquaintance in passing, my pulse quickening as if my body recognized a threat my mind refused to acknowledge. The words felt planted, deliberate, like breadcrumbs leading me towards something I didn't want to find. Then I began noticing the synchronization. The first time it happened, I was walking along the Neuse River Trail after work, trying to clear my head after a particularly brutal day. The path runs parallel to the water for miles, and I'd always found the sound of the current soothing. That evening, an older man in a worn baseball cap had been walking perhaps 20 feet behind me when I started down the trail. Nothing unusual. The path was popular with evening joggers and dog walkers. But as I walked, I became aware that his footsteps were matching mine exactly. When I slowed to observe a great blue heron fishing in the shallows, his pace slowed. When I quickened my step, so did he. I told myself it was coincidence, the natural rhythm two people might fall into when sharing the same path. Yet when I stopped abruptly to retie my shoe, I heard his footsteps continue for exactly 3 more beats before stopping as well. I glanced back. He was examining something on his phone, seemingly oblivious to my presence. When I resumed walking, so did he, and within moments, we'd fallen back into that eerily precise synchronization. I cut my walk short that evening, taking the first exit back to the parking area with my heart hammering against my ribs. The second incident occurred a week later at Lake Lynn. I'd gone there to meet a client for an informal lunch meeting at the small cafe overlooking the water. As we discussed quarterly projections, I noticed a woman in a green jacket walking the perimeter path behind where we sat. She moved with the measured pace of someone getting exercise, but something about her rhythm nagged at me. My client was mid-sentence when I realized what was bothering me. She was walking to the cadence of my heartbeat, the elevated rhythm I'd developed whenever I found myself near water. I excused myself to use the restroom, walking at a deliberately irregular pace. Through the cafe's window, I watched her adjust her speed to match mine, stumbling slightly as she tried to accommodate my erratic gait. When I sat back down, my client asked if I was feeling all right. I must have looked pale because he suggested we move our meeting indoors. I agreed quickly, but as we gathered our things, I heard him mention how the current economic climate was affecting everyone's stress levels. That word again. Current. I started avoiding water entirely. No more river trails, no more lakeside meetings, no more evening walks through the neighborhood where the storm drainage creek ran behind the houses. I found alternate routes to work that didn't cross any of the bridges over Crabtree Creek. I declined invitations to restaurants with waterfront patios and made excuses when friends suggested kayaking or fishing trips. But the synchronization followed me to dry land. At the grocery store, I'd notice other shoppers falling into step behind me as I moved through the aisles. Their cartwheels would begin to match the rhythm of mine, creating a soft percussion that made my skin crawl. In parking lots, I'd hear car doors slamming in sequence behind me, timing themselves to my footsteps on the asphalt. Even in office buildings, the elevator's mechanical hum seemed to adjust its pitch to match my breathing when strangers joined me for the ride. I began documenting everything: times, locations, descriptions of the people who seemed to be unconsciously mirroring my movements. The file on my computer grew thicker each week, filled with observations that sounded increasingly paranoid when I read them back to myself. A maintenance worker at the bank who swept the floor in rhythm with my pen tapping. A barista whose espresso machine seemed to pulse in time with my nervous fidgeting. A delivery driver whose truck engine idled in perfect synchronization with my anxious breathing. The words continued appearing in conversations with unsettling frequency. During a team meeting, my supervisor mentioned being pushed to meet new deadlines by someone behind the scenes. A neighbor complained about feeling like an acquaintance rather than a friend to someone she'd known for years. The radio in my car seemed to play an unusual number of songs with lyrics about water, rivers, and currents. I started recording conversations on my phone, convinced that I was imagining the prevalence of these trigger words. But when I played back the recordings, they were there, sometimes multiple times in a single exchange. The statistical probability seemed impossible, yet the evidence was undeniable. My 34th birthday arrived with the weight of impending doom. 11 more months until the arbitrary deadline the board had given me. though I kept telling myself it was meaningless superstition. I'd planned to spend the evening alone, safely away from any body of water, but my brother insisted on taking me out for dinner. The restaurant he chose was inland, a small Italian place with no aquatic themes in its decor. I began to relax as we ordered wine and settled into catching up on family news. The conversation flowed naturally until he mentioned his recent promotion. The whole thing came out of nowhere, he said, twirling pasta around his fork. One day I'm just another face in the crowd. Then suddenly I have this acquaintance in management pushing for me to move up. Someone I'd barely noticed before, working behind the scenes to get me noticed. My hand froze halfway to my mouth. An acquaintance? Yeah, you know how it is in corporate environments. You think you're swimming against the current, then someone throws you a lifeline. He paused, studying my expression. You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. I forced myself to take a bite, to nod and smile and pretend his word choices weren't sending electric shocks through my nervous system. But as the evening progressed, he seemed to work those specific words into the conversation with increasing frequency. Current events, being pushed for time, acquaintances from work. Each usage felt deliberate, purposeful, as if he were reading from a script I couldn't see. Walking to our cars afterward, I became acutely aware of his footsteps behind me. We'd parked in the same general area of the lot, so it made sense that we'd be walking in the same direction. But as we moved between the rows of vehicles, his pace matched mine with the precision of a metronome. When I slowed to check my phone, he slowed. When I quickened my step to avoid a puddle from the afternoon's rain, he quickened his. You sure you're feeling all right? He asked as we reached my car. You seem on edge tonight. I wanted to tell him everything. About the board, the predictions, the synchronized movements, the recurring words that had begun to feel like a countdown timer built into the fabric of reality itself. But how do you explain to someone that you believe a thrift store Ouija board has somehow programmed the universe to torment you with signs of your impending doom? Instead, I hugged him goodbye and drove home through streets that seemed unusually empty for a Friday night. The radio played nothing but static between stations, and I found myself checking the rearview mirror more frequently than necessary, looking for cars that might be matching my speed, following my turns, synchronizing their movements with mine. At home, I poured myself 3 fingers of bourbon and sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, scrolling through the document where I'd been recording my observations. The entries had grown more frequent and more detailed over the months, painting a picture of a man slowly losing his grip on reality, or discovering a truth too strange to be believed. I was rereading an entry from the previous week when I heard it, a soft scratching sound from the backyard. My house sits at the edge of a neighborhood that backs up to a small wooded area, and I often heard animals moving through the underbrush at night. But this sound had a rhythm to it, a deliberate cadence that made my pulse quicken. Scratch, pause, scratch. Scratch, pause, scratch. It was matching my heartbeat again. I moved to the back window and peered through the blinds. The yard was dark except for the weak glow of a neighbor's security light filtering through the trees. I couldn't see anything moving, but the scratching continued, always in perfect sync with the pulse I could feel throbbing in my temples. The sound stopped the moment I stepped away from the window. I returned to my laptop, but concentration was impossible. Every small noise, the refrigerator cycling on, the house settling, a car passing on the street, seemed to be timing itself to my breathing, my heartbeat, my nervous shifting in the chair. The sensation was maddening, like being surrounded by an orchestra that was constantly tuning itself to the frequency of my anxiety. By 2 a.m., I'd consumed most of the bottle and made a decision that felt both inevitable and insane. I pulled out my phone and called Davidson in Seattle. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice thick with sleep. Jesus, do you know what time it is here? I need to ask you something about that night, the board. There was a long pause. Are you drunk? Do you remember what it said? The exact words? Another pause, longer this time. Look, I know that thing freaked you out, but you can't seriously be. Do you remember the words or not? I heard him sigh, could picture him rubbing his eyes in the darkness of his bedroom 3,000 miles away. Something about an acquaintance pushing you, Into current, I think. Before you turned 35. His voice grew more alert. Why? What's going on? I told him everything. The synchronized movements, the recurring words, the growing sense that reality was somehow being orchestrated around me. He listened without interruption, and when I finished, the silence stretched so long I wondered if the call had dropped. Have you talked to anyone about this? A professional? You think I'm losing my mind? I think you're under a lot of stress, and stress can make us see patterns that aren't there. Remember, we were all controlling that thing together. It's not like it had supernatural knowledge. But even as he said it, I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. We'd all felt something strange that night, something that had made the joke feel less funny and more like a warning we didn't want to heed. After hanging up, I sat in the darkness of my kitchen, listening to the house around me. Every sound seemed deliberate now, part of a symphony being conducted by forces I couldn't see or understand. The ice maker in the freezer cycled on and off in rhythm with my breathing. The wind chimes on the neighbor's porch played their random notes in sequences that somehow felt purposeful. Outside, I could hear the distant sound of water, the storm drain system that carried runoff from the neighborhood toward the creek. The sound had never bothered me before, but now it felt like a presence in the darkness, patient and persistent, waiting for its moment. I have 10 months and 2 weeks left until my 35th birthday. 10 months and 2 weeks to figure out whether I'm documenting a supernatural conspiracy or chronicling my own descent into paranoid delusion. The distinction matters less each day, because the effect is the same. A growing certainty that something is approaching, something that knows exactly how to find me when the time comes. The bourbon is wearing off now, and I can hear my heartbeat clearly in the silence. Somewhere in the darkness outside, I'm certain something else is listening to that same rhythm, matching its movements to mine, waiting for the perfect moment to step out of the shadows. An acquaintance, the board had said. Someone I barely know. Someone who will approach from behind when I least expect it. Someone who will give me the final push toward whatever current awaits. I check my phone for the time, 3:47 a.m. In exactly 12 hours, I'll have to leave this house and venture back into a world where strangers unconsciously mirror my movements, and casual conversations contain the specific words that spell out my doom. I'll walk through my day pretending to be rational while scanning every face for signs of recognition, listening to every footstep for evidence of synchronization, avoiding every body of water as if my life depends on it. Because maybe it does. The scratching sound has returned to the backyard, soft and rhythmic, keeping perfect time with the pulse in my wrist. I close my laptop and head toward bed, knowing that sleep will bring dreams of dark water and approaching footsteps, of words spelled out in letters I never wanted to believe. 10 months and 2 weeks. The current is already calling.